Hey Guy, medieval assassins with their knives and poisonings that left their opponents no time to respond. You may have been wrong in what you've heard about this truth. Almost all assassins were not as successful as we imagine. They could have failed and been killed in the act. Alaric was assigned the role of approach. He faced the official posing as the host of the feast, carrying a gift box presented fancifully. Inside was a small knife, the outer fragments carefully wrapped to look like ornamentation. He practiced every flick of the hand so no one would notice. How to open the box with fingers light as feathers, to draw the knife when handing it over, to slip past the guards like a passing breeze. He imagined that moment, the king bowing to receive the gift, smiling, and the end nestled in a shortcut, enough to stop all conspiracies, to unravel the kingdom from its roots. But when that day came, nothing went according to the script in his head. The king did not pass through the square along the planned route. A sudden rainstorm came, and the communication lines, the people in charge of regulating the festivities, changed the order, causing Alaric to be standing in the wrong place. Moreover, a new guard was deployed. His eyes scrutinized more than usual, and when Alaric tried to present the box, his hand shook and the box made a clattering noise. Amid the roar of the rain, a slight halt, a sidelong glance, and everything dissolved. The king passed along another path, offering a forced smile to account, and the feast continued as if nothing had happened. Alaric withdrew in silence, feeling each heartbeat like a small drum beating in his chest. He returned to the hideout. No one spoke. No one blamed him. There was only a dense silence, and Isolde's eyes quietly asked, "What did we learn?" Let's go deeper from the beginning to get a clearer picture of the medieval assassins and their near-death failures. I will tell you about a man whose name history never records, a shadow moving silently through the corridors of power, persistent like water carving into stone. The story begins in an age when the kingdom was built on fear, with the promise of order, and a king, one whom no one dared to call by name outside the inner court, was becoming unbearable in the eyes of many. The king of draconian edicts, of ever-increasing taxes, of nights guarded by a quiet unease. It was said that he ruled with a cold stare, and the promise that anyone who resisted would be wiped out. His kingdom was a stone wall draped over hills and valleys, but beneath that brick veneer, the hungry people whispered about change. The name of the one meant to change fate was Alaric. People might call him an assassin, a traitor, or purposeful darkness. I, when telling this story, only call him the one who walks between silences. For as you will see, Alaric was not born with a knife in his hand or malice behind his eyes. He had been a boy in a small village beside a winding river, where the meagre harvests barely yielded a few dark loaves, where his mother, a healer, brewed medicines to ease the pain of the elderly, and his father, a carpenter, carved small protective marks on windows to shield the home from misfortune. It was a simple life, pale and quiet like rain falling on an autumn afternoon. Then once a decree passed down from the capital. The king ordered the confiscation of property to maintain order, and the people of Alaric's village were torn apart by double taxes. His father was summoned to a distant campaign and never returned, and his mother was accused of witchcraft for healing the poor without a royal license. They were dragged into the square, forced to witness the punishment as a lesson for other villages. Alaric's mother was branded with the red mark of suspicion, then left by the roadside under the contemptuous stares of the guards. The village was taxed again, and Alaric, then old enough to understand that the world was unfair, walked silently through the night with a whispered promise in his heart. If he could not change the oppressor, he would take away the greatest power they believed untouchable. Alaric did not turn to violence immediately. Many years later, when old scars had already set deep, and the name King had become synonymous with sighs and choked cries, he left his village with a small pouch containing only a few items. His mother's empty medicine bottles, a folding knife whittled from an old tree trunk that his father had made before departing, and a piece of cloth stained from nights of crying without sleep. He went to the great city, where the wind striking the roof tiles was like an unending whisper. There he wandered through narrow alleys, learning how to live quietly, learning how to hide among crowds, and above all, learning how to watch, to see the transparency in officials' faces, the movements of the guards, the silence of women leaving the market with dirty hands, and the stories wrapped in every breath of the townspeople. He sought out old books in an abandoned library, studied the art of concealment, of understanding and manipulating minds with glances and small gestures, and most of all, about death that leaves no sound, a concept that at first was, to him, only a marginal note in a book written in faded ink. Then Alaric met others, people like him, of no noble blood, without titles but carrying a silent hatred for the court. There was a woman named Isolde, once a scholar in the royal library, dismissed and stripped of her career for daring to translate documents about the rights of commoners. A former garrison soldier named Roderick, the husband of a farmer whose land had been confiscated. And an orphan boy named Tarvin, who had watched his father taken away for failing to pay taxes and tortured before his eyes. They didn't say, "We will assassinate the king." At first, they said, "We will make this kingdom hurt less." But the distance between words and deeds was drawn tight. And gradually the shadow of the king blurred in their eyes into a focal point, the one standing atop the iceberg, the source of the edicts, deciding the fate of hundreds of thousands from a dizzying height, untouchable. Their secret circle had no grand hall. They met in dry wine cellars, behind chipped wooden tables, snuffing out candles at the sound of unfamiliar footsteps, and exchanged messages through carefully folded scraps of paper. Alaric, with his silence as a natural trait, became the one who relayed everything the group needed to know. The king's routes, the times he attended ceremonies, his nighttime habits, the structure of his guard, and most importantly, the weakness hidden beneath the brilliance the court displayed. The king had a habit of walking alone on gloomy nights, when the cold air clung to the hems of his robes. He had a small garden behind the palace, where he would release sighs into the air before returning to the throne. That was where Alaric first saw him. Not a monument of iron, but a man with deep eyes and hands that trembled slightly when holding a cup of tea, as if something unspeakable lay behind his eyelids. And then they began to plan. The first plan was the simplest. A veiled challenge, a small trap, an assassination with a knife hidden during the autumn festival ceremony, when the king would appear before the crowd. It was a grand banquet, golden and glowing, with flowing music and the scent of jasmine in the air. The king would pass through the square, shake hands with the nobles, wear a smile cold as ice, and among the crowd, a lute player would be tasked with shielding the moment in sound, drawing just enough attention to muffle any faint noise. Alaric was assigned the role of approach. He faced the official disguised as the host of the feast, carrying a gift box ornately presented. Inside was a small knife, its sharp edges carefully wrapped to resemble decorative embellishments. He trained every flick of the wrist so that no one would notice, the way to open the box with fingers light as feathers, to reveal the blade while handing it over, to slip past the guards like a passing breeze. He envisioned the moment, the king bowing to receive the gift, smiling, and the end nestled in a shortcut, just enough to halt every scheme, to dismantle the kingdom from its roots. But when that day came, nothing followed the script in his mind. The king did not pass through the square as planned. A sudden rainstorm descended, and the communication lines and festival coordinators changed the order of events, placing Alaric in the wrong spot. Worse still, a newly deployed guard, his eyes more attentive than usual, watched closely, and when Alaric tried to present the box, his hand trembled, and it made a clattering sound. Amid the noise of the rain, a soft clunk, a misdirected glance, and everything dissolved. The king took another path, offering a false smile to account, and the feast carried on as if nothing had happened. Alaric withdrew in silence, feeling each heartbeat like a small drum pounding in his chest. He returned to the hideout. No one said a word, no one cast blame. There was only a thick silence, and Isolde's eyes quietly asked, "What did we learn? What did we—" They learned that randomness, rain, a new guard, a small change in the route, could wreck a plan calculated down to the tiniest detail. They did not give up. They began to build multiple layers of backup plans. People holding information about the weather, bribed messengers to alert them to any shifts in advance, and even someone posing as a seer to predict changes in the king's path, making those near him watch closely as if they were guarding a sacred truth. The second plan was drawn up without fanfare. It did not take place before a crowd, but in a space that seemed to attract little notice. The narrow road leading out of the city, where the king sometimes went to rest after meetings in the council chamber. Alaric and Roderick attempted to set a delicate trap. A weakened section of wooden bridge was reworked to collapse under sufficient weight. Directly beneath the shrubbery, the king frequently passed. The idea was that he would walk there on a mild afternoon, alone, and the trap would send him into a small pit, from which another, Tavin, would complete the rest. They had followed the king's route weekly, recorded his habits, and picked a day that appeared favourable. No rain, fewer accompanying soldiers, because the king needed space to rest. The trap was installed, each plank camouflaged, a thin cord hiding the collapse mechanism. Tavin stood at a distance close enough to intervene, eyes open, ready. Alaric felt the tension spreading through the air, like the moments before a storm. But this time failed as well. A shepherd boy passed by, saw something strange beneath the shrubbery, and out of curiosity, prodded it with a small stick. The stick caused a faint tremor, and in those few silent seconds, Roderick, standing nearby and not fully informed of that tiny adjustment, shifted slightly to avoid the accidental touch. When the king approached, at the exact moment of tension, the trap did not spring. Not because of faulty design, but because an old arrow shaft embedded in the plank had made it hold the weight, something Alaric and the others could not have known. The old boards had been replaced earlier by the palace's mysterious craftsman under the pretense of sluggish repairs, and the spot they had intended to be weak had become solid. The king passed, lifted his head to the sky, sighed as if to shake off fatigue, and kept walking. Tavin curled inward coldly, and Roderick muttered a word only those who share suffering would understand. Alaric withdrew again, this time feeling something heavier. Not failure, but the realization that the luck of the ruler was not always magic. It was a web of tiny details, and they were trying to tear apart a net without truly knowing which threads held it together. They needed time. They began to cultivate more connections inside the palace. A cobbler who listened to the servants' stories, a cellar attendant who passed along information about the king's meal schedule, and a female builder, in disguise, who befriended the royal architect. Each small piece was put in place quietly, without drama or tension that might arouse suspicion. Alaric, who once believed that a single well-placed stab could change a kingdom, now understood that there had to be a combination of emotion, timing, and long-term perspective. An assassin uses not only a blade, but patience itself as a tool of pain. By this point, the king in their story was no longer just a towering shadow. In the group's telling, he became a series of recurring moments. His solitary afternoon walks to breathe, the private letters delivered by his own hand, the eunuch summoned to read him poetry, his bowed head before an ancient statue in the prayer chamber like someone seeking forgiveness he would never receive. Alaric saw the man beneath the iron armour, a man also trapped by the system, forced to maintain a hardened image so his subjects would not rebel, so isolated that he depended on ritual to keep himself from collapse. Empathy swept over him like an unexpected breeze, something he had never anticipated. But hatred did not vanish. It only grew more complex. Part of him wanted to tear down the entire system, while another part wondered whether the death of its head would truly lighten the kingdom, or simply replace one void with another chaos. And then just before this chapter closed, they decided to try something. A combination of long observation and a delicate trap called almost unnoticeable. The king would continue his nightly habit of going to the garden behind the palace. They placed an ornate, ancient vessel beneath the tree canopy, filled with a special scent. Not an immediate poison, but a blend that made whoever inhaled it feel slightly dizzy, disoriented for a few seconds, enough to subtly throw the guards off, and enough for Alaric to move closer without rousing suspicion. The vessel sat in the low shrubbery, disguised as an old stone. Isolde herself studied the scent's composition. Roderick prepared the escape route. Tavin rehearsed reacting to that fleeting window to reach in and finish it if the chance came. And Alaric sat still like a storyteller, waiting for the climax, feeling each breath of the night, as if he himself had become part of the whispering black background. That night came. The space was dim, a light mist covering the grass. The king appeared, walking slowly, his eyes seemingly seeing through to something distant, a cup of hot tea in his hand bringing pure warmth into the cold night. The guards, weakened by the calming scent, drifted by like shadows. And as the king entered the garden, no one saw the flask lying there. He was almost within reach of the throne. The long shadow behind him seemed to stretch toward it. And then, a very faint sound. The wind whistling through a gap in the leaves made the king turn his head. His eyes stopped at a spot where the leaves were rustling, something that should not have been moving at that time. Something instinctual made him pause and lean slightly to the side. And the final part of the plan, the part Alaric had been waiting for, never had the chance to happen. After that almost night, Alaric didn't say much. In the silence of the cellar where they gathered, there was only the crackle of the fire and the even deep breaths of each person. The almost was not an empty consolation. It was a promise to themselves, and in Isolde's eyes it had a different shade. Not just persistence anymore, but a calculated expectancy. They couldn't keep striking at the almost forever. This time had to be something else. Not to throw the king off course. Not to rely on randomness, but to lead randomness to the place they wanted. Alaric began by listening. He spent the days that followed not pursuing a new plan immediately, but listening. He sat in the corners of small tea houses near the palace, sipping bitter tea, jotting down what people said about the king. Some cursed under their breath. Some spoke of the king sitting alone in the prayer chamber, eyes dull as he stared at the old statue. An aging servant who had once served the king recounted that when he was a boy, the king had helped a lost child, and his hands trembled not from age but from something else, revulsion at his own image in the mirror. Isolde dug through old correspondence, searching for memories blurred in the replies from advisors who had been exiled, and uncovered something that seemed contradictory. The king, erected as a symbol of untouchability, always felt a look watching him in the night. Not from the guards, but like an incomplete memory, as if someone had once taught him, "You cannot hide sin in darkness without it looking back at you." That was the missing shard they needed, a king not made entirely of iron, but a man carrying a burden. They did not intend to exploit pity. Instead, they planned to use that very burden to lead him into a trap he would believe was part of redemption. The third plan, known internally as the whisper of conscience, began to take shape. They would not stab directly at the king's heart with a blade, but plant a narrative in his mind. A series of subtle events that would make the king believe a forgotten soul was knocking at his door in reproach, leading him to a place he believed could offer solace. And there, Alaric would be waiting. The details were woven slowly. Isolde uncovered old poems the king used to read during moments of self-reflection. She carefully rewrote them as notes left behind in rooms or blown by the wind to places he frequented. Roderick, in the guise of a retired veteran, posed as a newly reassigned guard, someone who would whisper vague words into the king's ear about sleep paralysis, a feeling of being watched, nudging him toward introspection. Tavin, with his instinct for shaping silence, placed a string of subtle signs in the palace garden. A teacup slightly off-centre, an old book forgotten on a bench, a dried flower that seemed to have slipped from someone's hand. Small things just enough to stir a habit, to make the king believe that someone was trying to reach out. But the centrepiece lay in a small object, a silver pendant crafted as an exact replica of the one the king often carried with him during his moments of prayer. In the legends they had gathered, That pendant was a gift he received from a compassionate mother during his days as a prince, a symbol of the promise not to let oneself be lost. Alaric knew that if he could place the shadow of memory into it, a trace that made the king believe the pendant itself was speaking to him, instinct would draw him to the place that was usually his refuge, a small room tucked in the corner of an old corridor used to understand restless souls. That, they believed, was where he sought the deepest solace, the ideal condition for confrontation, when there would be no crowds, no pride, only him and the interrogated self. To carry it out, they needed two things. First, access to the real pendant to create an identical copy, and second, a way for the king to feel that the pendant was reflecting the voice of conscience, something no one else could hear. Getting the replica posed a major risk. The king almost never took it off in public. Alaric chose an old method, leveraging connections with small-time jewellers in the night market, including a polishing craftsman who had once repaired a ring for a member of the royal family. They spread a rumour that a spirit-bound object was on display at the market, something that drew in those who believed in omens. One of the king's servants, who harboured some resentment due to cold treatment, was lured into the market one night with the invitation to see a lucky charm that could help the king find peace again. The real pendant, during a brief moment it was handed over for inspection, was discreetly copied by Alaric and Isolde. The replica was aged slightly and infused with a special essential oil, a faint aroma that blurred the line between alertness and the sensation of someone whispering in your ear. Not poison, but a subtle mental stimulus. The king would feel as though a story was being stirred from old memory, drawing him to seek out the place of redemption, to look back at himself. The fake pendant was returned to its place through a carefully orchestrated sequence of subtle actions. A servant loyal to the group was placed inside the palace under the guise of a newly hired chambermaid. That person, a woman named Myra, once the daughter of a scholar executed for speaking the truth, was rigorously trained to reveal no trace of intent and to release only faint breaths, quick sideways glances that seemed accidental whenever the king reflected. One night, with his mind stretched thin by faint whisperings, the king felt the gentle touch of the past through the pendant. He told himself, "I once promised not to forget. Someone remembers me." And that very someone was the story that they had planted in his mind. A forgotten soul calling for forgiveness. But like all things, the so-called perfect plan held shadows they hadn't foreseen. On the very night they intended to trigger it, a small event tilted everything. A stray rooster from a nearby coop let out an unusual crow just as the king was sitting in prayer. The sound echoed through the small chamber like a tug, causing the pendant to tremble slightly against his chest. He bowed his head, and in that moment, it wasn't the imagined whisper, but a real memory, an image of his mother when she was alive, reminding him that a promise must never be forgotten. The pendant didn't need to whisper, he made it speak on his own. The king, pulled out of the blurred space of the plan, became alert. Myra, following the precise rhythm, tried to reel him back in with a glance. But that awareness settled over him like a new layer of skin. He sensed the closeness and stepped away. The group realised by not confronting him directly, they had come closer to what was inside. But they had also given him the power to regain control. That night, the king did not sleep. He went to the garden, looked at the pendant as if looking at someone, then withdrew, without ever truly finding the answer. It wasn't a complete failure because something strange happened afterward. The king began to hold longer silences when speaking with his advisors. He skipped minor rituals he had never once forgotten before. The group suddenly noticed an effect. The whisper no longer needed to be entirely of their making. They had opened a small crack in the armour of his mind, and so they changed course. The plan was no longer just to bring him to a point of ending, but to plant long-lasting questions in his thoughts, to make him doubt every moment of solace, and begin searching for the origin of that doubt himself. In the meantime, tension arose within the group, not in loud arguments, but like a slow erosion. Roderick began to question the value of not ending it now, when they could pierce a hole in the scale of power and order. Tavin, who had once relied purely on instinct, now felt the almost becoming a foggy veil, and suggested a more direct action, a strike against one of the king's closest advisors, to frighten the king into revealing a vulnerability. Isolde remained firm in her belief. When the crack widens, people don't just see it, they try to fix it, and in fixing it, they expose the old threads. Alaric stood in the middle, torn between urging the plan forward or maintaining its long drawn-out breath. Certainty always carried the risk of becoming recklessness. A man who made history as silently as he did knew. If you strike too fast, the blood spills too loudly to hide it. But strike too slowly, and the target may see every move. As 2 weeks passed after the night of the pendant, the king began to develop a new quirk. He started walking down unusual corridors, pausing before walls that no one understood why, closing his eyes as if to listen. Maera reported that, in one such moment, he whispered a phrase to no one in particular. "Someone once taught me how to look into myself." That was a small success none in the group could speak aloud. They were cracking the mask, not with blades but with warped gazes, with silent questioning, with time. And then an unexpected shift occurred. One of the king's closest advisors, Count Edric, came under suspicion of treason due to strange correspondence sent from a border region. The king, already unsettled, already sleepless from stories of eyes in the dark, suddenly became more easily swayed. The group recognised this as a new opportunity. They didn't intend to kill Edric. They wanted to turn him into a pawn, adding more layers of doubt, pushing the king closer to searching for the true origin of the darkness within himself. Isolde planted a few suggestive phrases through a trusted servant. Because we all carry guilt, there must be one who can record the truth, not to condemn, but to heal. Edric, shaken, began to reveal old stories, how he had once seen the king with the pendant, had heard whispering voices at night. And from that, a web of distrust began to spread within the court. The king, in quiet fear, started demanding more detailed reports on everyone around him, digging into the pasts of those closest to him, and even summoned a private priest to pray for clarity. Alaric realised that the third plan, though it did not strike directly at the king's heart, was creating a new atmosphere. A king who no longer fully trusted himself, who began to ask, "Who can see me?" And not just who was watching, but what within himself made him feel watched. They had planted doubt, and that doubt had begun to thin the shell of his self-confidence. This was both a remarkable step forward and a double-edged sword, for a king who doubts himself may grow harsher, and a harsher king might impose new layers of security, shrinking the gaps they had been slowly opening. On a quiet rainy afternoon, as Alaric and the group gathered again, Isolde opened a new notebook. She traced the path of the whispers they had sown, marking the points where the king had reacted. The pendant, the conversation with Edric, the silent moments in the corridors. She said, "We've begun to hide blades inside stories, and the cut has been made. But it's not deep enough for him to realise he's bleeding. Next time we won't make a bigger move. We'll let him seek it out himself. He will go to the place he thinks holds the answer, and we'll show him a glass wall, something he believes is truth reflected back. But in reality, it's his own self being mirrored. When he touches that wall, the reaction will be that of someone forgotten. Fear, compulsion, and in the end, something revealed." What happened next was no longer a matter of almost or a king slowly eroded by doubt. It became a wide crack spreading, and this time, real blood was spilled. They had thought they were carefully arranging fragments of a mirror to clearly see the reflection within, but that very mirror shattered, and the shards cut into the flesh of those who stood too close. There are failures you can recognise in hindsight, and there are breaks that no one can foresee. But what killed a comrade wasn't merely failure. It was the consequence of placing trust in a chain of fragile calculations, strung between emotion and chance. The plan called the Whisper of Conscience had opened a fissure. The king began asking, "Who sees me?" And then, "Who am I to be seen?" But that fissure let something else in, Not just external doubt, but internal suspicion toward those closest to him. And that very confusion led to a new eye. Not the one they had planted, the gaze in the dark, but the eyes of those who worked for the crown. Advisors trained to listen for whispers, and more importantly, a new figure brought in. A young priest, transferred from a borderland monastery, appointed as the king's personal spiritual overseer. He carried with him a coal hollies. The cracks Isolde had drawn in her notebook began to shine brighter on a foggy morning. The king, after a long night of clarity, requested a private meeting with a forgotten soul, which, in his belief, was the shadow within the pendant. They decided this time it would be a reflection, strong enough not only to draw him in, but to make him seek dialogue with it of his own accord. Alaric, dressed simply, would be brought in as the intermediary between the king and the shadow. Myra would create the right atmosphere to make the king feel compelled to open up by making him believe the gaze had witnessed a new sign, an invitation from within himself. They executed everything as planned, planted subtle clues, made the guards turn their eyes elsewhere, and placed just enough overheard exchanges in the corners of the room for the king to believe someone was trying to help him. And the king came. He entered the small chamber, his face weary, his eyes lit with inner questioning. The pendant swayed gently as he touched it, and Alaric, seated behind a sheer curtain like a shadow, waited. The plan was for the king to speak with it on his own, to admit something, and then Alaric would emerge like a reflection from outside and say, "If you do not walk this path, the blade of fate will not spare you." In that moment, a mark would be imprinted on his mind, a compulsion just strong enough to weaken his certainty, but not sharp enough to trigger alarms in the days to come. But there was one thing they hadn't accounted for. The king, in his sleepless nights, had begun to write. He recorded the whispers, not just hearing them silently anymore, but turning them into fragments of sentences within letters addressed to himself, encoded reflections. And the young priest the court had recently assigned was no innocent man. He was someone trained to read every pause. When the king elevated the gaze story into a self-reflective exercise, the priest recognized that the moment Alaric appeared was not a deliverance, but something orchestrated. He began to trace the anomalies, the subtle shift in the king's breathing when hearing certain suggestions, the small scratch marks on Myra's wrist, signs that she had been forcing herself to stay composed while guarding a secret, and an invisible thread leading toward those who frequently passed near the prayer chamber. One evening, just as the plan entered its imprint phase, it was broken. One of the king's newer servants, not Myra, but someone added later, due to a minor staffing change the group hadn't noticed, discovered a small box hidden in the hallway leading to the king's private chamber. Inside was a piece of cloth with a faint scent, the same one Isolde had used to mark the space, and a silver pendant set slightly askew, one of the techniques they had used to lure the king by showing him echoes of the past. This servant, suspicious, brought it to the priest. The priest examined it carefully, removed it from its place as something inconsistent with the natural order. What followed was a series of cold, calculated actions. Myra was summoned in the middle of the night, questioned with words that were not direct but tight like a stretched cord. "Who did you serve before I began to hear those whispers? Has someone entered my chamber whom I no longer remember?" She remained silent, but her eyes betrayed tension. Roderick was summoned into the great hall to hear the king proclaim, "The signal has shown itself. Deception has crept in slowly. They want me to believe I am being watched, but is it not I who is watching myself?" The small anchor they had placed was now swaying, and from that sway, the intended reflection twisted into total suspicion. Amid that confusion, Tarvin, the one known as the Eyes of the Dark, was given a temporary task to approach a young palace guard, someone who was essentially the in-between in the internal web of the court. He was instructed that if suspicion grew too intense, he was to create a small break, a whisper in the guard's ear to lead him toward a piece of information that would make him believe Edric was manipulating the king. The goal was to stir a layer of overlapping doubt, to mask the direct investigation into my era and the distinct signs of the gaze. But what no one knew was that the young priest had been watching Tavin for some time. That man had turned Tavin's stealth into a trap against him. He pretended to believe the ruse, granted Tavin authorized access, and then observed his every move. When Tavin drew close, preparing to drop the bait, that bait became the blade that exposed him. He was caught on the spot, not with loud force, but with the silence of a precise trap. Secret cords coiled around his wrists, and in the small chamber nearby, the king looked at Tavin as one would look at someone revealed to be turning their back on the gaze. He was interrogated, not for great information, but out of fear. And to send a hard message, Tavin wasn't merely detained, he was made an example before a select few with authority. Not a dramatic death, but a quiet disappearance. One morning the door to his room was opened, and only his worn-out shoes remained, along with a folded slip of paper. Do not trust the darkness that watches itself. Someone is watching you back. Tavin's death was the first shock. It wasn't the kind of death found on a chaotic battlefield, but one dismantled by the very reflection of the silence they had used to conceal themselves. Alaric saw the probability of collapse unfold before his eyes. The man they had used to guide trust was now used as a mirror to expose them. Tavin had never been one to speak much. Before he was taken, he looked at Alaric just once. His eyes held no plea, only a quiet whisper. Don't let the light be revealed by dissecting too deeply. It wakes people up. Then he disappeared. No screams, no great bloodstain. Just an empty space where he used to sit in the cellar, and a silence that would not be filled for a long time, not even by breathing. They wrapped their grief in silence. Isolde didn't weep aloud. She took out her notebook and drew a new line, a red dot beside Tavin's name, and a small note. The price of not fully understanding the one who reflects. Roderick began to drink more, and with each drink came a longer silence. Maera, she wasn't exposed immediately, but the investigation placed her under an unrelenting gaze. If Tavin could be uncovered, anyone could. She moved through the palace like someone carrying a heavy secret, and sometimes Alaric saw her sitting still, palm pressed against her chest as if trying to keep a part of herself from breaking. And then it was Roderick's turn. They had believed that when the king was cornered by confusion, he would show impatience toward those who were possibly involved. Roderick, once a former garrison soldier, was summoned due to inconsistencies in his reports. In a drunken haze, he scoffed at a newly appointed official sent to investigate. That scoff was interpreted as concealment. He was taken to a private interrogation, not with grand swords or overt violence, but a kind of judgment delivered from above, an ambiguous accusation, followed by a confession extracted through psychological torture, placing him in a small room, forced to listen to his own past words, the goals they had once set. Roderick resisted, first with rage, then with exhaustion. And then one night, when he was led outside, under the watchful eyes of those called loyal, he was thrown across a quiet stretch of road. And the accident occurred. A cart filled with lumber, rigged, slipped and crushed him. On the surface, it was an accident. Within the inner circle, it was a warning. No one was allowed to get too close to the eye that was now turning inward. Roderick didn't die immediately. He was imprisoned, living in the splinters of pain. A week later, he took his own life, according to the palace's official report, by starving himself. And they said, the life of one who once knew the truth has come to an end. But Alaric knew better. It wasn't self-inflicted. It was a decision cornered by force, by the feeling that his identity had been played as a pawn, and there was nowhere left safe to return to. Two were lost. Tavin, the silent eyes of the dark, became a void. And Roderick, the hammer hidden behind his rough demeanour, turned into a faint shadow of quiet rage. Alaric felt the weight of choice pressing on his chest. He had once believed that prolonging the plan was wisdom. Now he heard a different whisper, not from the king, but from the shadows of those who had died before they could speak. Time doesn't always save. Time can also be the place where the wind slowly takes souls away until there's no one left to tell the story to the living. They knew what they had to do next, but the meaning of had to had changed. No longer how to draw the king deeper into reflection, but how to survive long enough to keep telling the story. Alaric began to shift the rhythm. Those who remained, Isolde, Maera, and himself, began analysing. Where had the plan been exposed? Why was Tavin captured? How was Roderick pushed to the edge? They drew a new map. No longer fragmented pieces, but a network. A system of defence and misdirection in reverse. Instead of trying to make the king feel watched, they would convince him that the gaze was now natural, a part of himself that could not be separated, and at the same time fully conceal the ones holding the mirror. Maera was pulled back from her direct servant role. She became a false messenger, one who scattered unrelated signs to divert the eye of suspicion. Isolde began writing misleading tales for the king to read, stories of another monarch tormented by darkness in his mind, who discovered that the only path forward was to believe in forgiveness. And while the king read, they planted just enough false information to make the young priest begin re-evaluating the source of the abnormalities. Alaric from the background began to speak more, not to the king, but to those close to him. He painted the image of a shared darkness threatening the kingdom, causing them to instinctively protect their faith, rather than scrutinise each individual too closely. But the cost of that shift was a deeper fracture within the group. Maera began to wonder if she might be the next to be sacrificed. Isolde carried a cold clarity within her. She never allowed herself open emotion, but each night she opened her notebook, drawing new lines, erasing old names. As if the loss of Tavin and Roderick were an old glaze that had to be scraped away to keep what was being built from cracking. Alaric, who had once believed himself to be the one who walks between silences, now felt like the one who walks on shards, each step threatening to echo with the sound of breaking. One night when they gathered after Roderick's death, Isolde said something none of them would ever forget. "We have silenced old shadows, not by hiding them, but by pressing them to where they could no longer breathe. Perhaps next time we won't place another cut. We place a different path, a road the king walks on his own. And when he reaches the end, the one behind him won't be the one hiding a blade, but the one holding the mirror." Alaric understood that holding the mirror didn't mean striking the final blow. It could be a mirror so clear that the king would see the truth of himself. So much so that, in a moment of confusion, he would create a larger opening than they ever could. And this time they would have to keep the remaining members alive by ensuring that opening didn't become a cry of alarm. From the moment Tavin and Roderick fell, the darkness of the mission was no longer just the gaze in the dark. It had become a nightmare that tormented every step. Those who remained, Isolde, Maera, and Alaric, each carried a silent fear. The fear that any one of them could become the thin piece, torn from the fragile web holding them together. The air in the hidden cellar grew increasingly stifling. In the early days the fire still crackled, but now each time the oil lamp flickered, it was like the wind brushing across an invisible unrest. Isolde began to see blurred figures each time she walked through the corridor. Once she wondered if someone strange was following her, but when she turned back it was only her own shadow cast against the brick wall. Maera, smiling gently with the servants by day, at night dreamed of Tavin's scream rising from beneath the earth. "Don't let me stay silent forever." And Alaric, who once felt confident as the one leading, now found himself lost at a crossroads, to protect his comrades or to push the plan forward. In the days of unease, they decided to operate in complete isolation. Every communication via secret signals, no face-to-face contact. Each had a distinct task. Isolde continued to write blurred narratives to lure the king. Maera spread misleading signs throughout the palace, and Alaric would directly approach the mirror in the king's mind. Strict rules were laid, no acting alone, and information was to be locked tight, shared only with the relevant person. But as the darkness thickened, so did the fear, and even the lock they believed unbreakable began to show cracks. Isolde and the fading silhouette. That night Isolde sat before the candle holder, eyes fixed on her notebook, mapping the king's psychology. She needed to find a new point of contact, an event just strong enough to push the king to the edge of doubt, but not enough to make him lose control. She decided to write a short letter, forged as if from Edric, saying, "If you wish for a piece of truth, find me at the clock tower at midnight." The letter was placed in a bamboo tube left in the royal hallway, where Edric rarely passed. She hoped the king would grow curious and go, creating a quiet meeting with only himself. But she forgot one thing, the internal fragility. One of Edric's former servants, who had never liked him, accidentally found the tube. He read it quickly, believing he was doing good, thinking he was helping the king catch Edric. Instead of leaving the letter where it was, he brought it to the king's spiritual advisor, the young priest. The priest read it, frowned. He didn't report it to Edric, but went directly to the king. The king, awoken in the middle of the night, wondered why Edric wanted to meet him. He felt the rise of deceit and concluded that Edric truly was the one pulling the strings. By morning, Edric had been dismissed, summoned for interrogation, and soon after confined to the western dungeon tower. Isolde heard the news through Maera, and her heart sank. The letter had never been meant for Edric. She realised that the breach in their protection didn't only come from the king, but from the servants, the pawns who knew nothing of the plan, acting purely on instinct. What she had thought was a lure story had now turned into a hunt for Edric. She blamed herself, but there was no time for self-pity. Edric's fall would only deepen the king's paranoia, making him even more ruthless to anyone who approached. Isolde knew, if they didn't regain the initiative soon, all three of them, and even Edric, would perish in the royal noose. Maera among spies. At the same time, Maera was tasked with scattering faint traces that suggested the king had once asked Edric to hide a secret letter. She was instructed to pass through the correspondence chambers, distract the guards, then place forged letters in Edric's drawer. But Maera, haunted by the mysterious deaths of Tavin and Roderick, acted hastily. She placed the letter neatly into the drawer, but suddenly thought she needed to leave before the guards returned. In her rush, she forgot to turn off the glowing gem attached to the envelope, a signature mark of their group, meant for Edric to identify the message. The gentle glow of the gem shone for a few seconds in the darkness, then faded as Maera closed the drawer. A few hours later, Edric, briefly released from the dungeon, was brought into the writing room. He didn't dare search the place, but a guard noticed the open drawer and the faint flash of the gem. It was enough to trigger a psychological alarm. "Someone lit a light for me." Edric turned around, his footing lost. He began to panic. Maera, hidden in a nearby corner, witnessed the entire scene. She wanted to run in and explain, but she couldn't. They weren't allowed to face Edric directly. Her eyes welled up as she saw him clutch his chest and rush out, murmuring something like, "Never safe again." From then on, Edric began acting alone. He tried to approach each courtier, whispering about a rebel group using sorcery to deceive the senses. He tried to form a counter-network, using his authority to investigate. Instead of contacting Isolde or Maera, Edric went himself into the private archives, looking for the secret letter, unaware it was a forgery, then handed it to the young priest. The priest, already suspicious of everything, cut the letter into pieces and sent it for analysis to trace the origin of the ink and paper. This decision led to a chain of interrogations, not just of Edric, but of everyone connected to him. Edric fled into the night, chased by guards, eventually falling in the castle courtyard and breaking his ankle. In panic, he had no one to call for. A strange figure, someone who had witnessed Maera planting the letter, ran over, seized Edric, and buried him beneath the old grain storage. By morning, all that was found were his boots kneeling beside one remaining leg, and a scribbled message on the wall. "I am not the liar." Maera rushed to the scene in pain, but was chased away by the guards, Alaric, and the rushing footsteps. While Isolde and Maera were forced to watch the people they once trusted fall into terror and death, Alaric faced the most direct pressure. It was his turn to act. The final decision had been made. That night, he would approach the king, not through secrecy anymore, but in a face-to-face encounter. The intent was to place the king before a final reflection, to push him to reveal himself in the midst of overwhelming confusion, and then use that moment to force a choice: forgiveness or punishment. Alaric changed his clothing, no longer the carpenter's garb or the robe of a false monk, but the ceremonial attire of a former royal attendant, someone summoned only at midnight by the king himself. He memorized a replica of the royal summons, refined every stroke of his handwriting, then immersed himself in silence. Every breath he took sounded like a drum counting down the seconds. When the clock tower struck midnight, Alaric stood at the palace gates. He spoke, calm and steady. "I humbly beg the presence of His Majesty." The king appeared, face worn, eyes red with fatigue. He looked at Alaric, whom he now believed to be the one who turned Edric against him, who made Tavin vanish. Alaric bowed, his voice gentle. "To awaken the gaze within you, I ask to speak a few words." The king tilted his head, his eyes seeming to search the darkness for one final doubt. Alaric began recounting the failures of Tavin, of Roderick, of Edric. He spoke of the clash between the king's gaze and the shadows, of the network of mirrors he and his allies had planted throughout the palace, but used words like incantations. Each sentence carved an image of isolation, of despair, and of a single path to salvation: personal forgiveness. He didn't accuse the king. He placed the king in a position where you are the only one who can save the kingdom and your soul. Every poetic line Isolde had written was now seamlessly woven into Alaric's speech, echoing the whispers the king once heard from the pendant. Someone is watching. Someone needs me. Someone forgives. The king fell silent, his eyes welling with tears. In that moment, Alaric believed the final plan had succeeded. The king would let go of the chain holding his soul down and open the door himself for Alaric to place the final mark. But the history of darkness never allows easy victories. Just as Alaric began to speak words of comfort, a side door suddenly slammed open. A squad of guards burst in, weapons drawn. Standing beside them was the young priest, his eyes cold as ice. "How long have you been deceiving His Majesty?" Amid flickering, candlelight and blades pressed close, Alaric realised. The final reflection was merely a trap in reverse, an ambush to corner him. And in the silence of that moment he quietly understood. When fear becomes chaos, no one controls the plan anymore. The plan begins to control them. Alaric stood amidst the flickering firelight of the great hall. No sword lunged, no shout echoed back. Only a silence so heavy, it felt as though every stone in the castle was holding its breath. The guards formed a circle around him, and in the centre stood the king, his face no longer that of a man whose confidence had been touched, but a fragile shell starting to crack. Beside the king, the young priest sat quietly, eyes cold, as if watching a play whose every line he had predicted. No command was needed. The guards seized Alaric, his wrists bound in coarse leather straps. They brought him down into the dungeon, not a cell shared with common criminals, but a small room, lightless, where the damp walls seemed to drain the breath from the air. Those in power wanted answers, not just motives. They wanted to know who still lived, who had yet to be exposed, who had helped him. Alaric was placed before an old wooden table, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear of death, but from the weight of knowing that every word he spoke could set fire to the lives of his companions. The young priest entered, carrying no sword, only a small leather-bound book, and a voice that lingered like an incantation. "You made the king believe the darkness was truth, but darkness can reflect too. What would you say to save yourself, and who will take your place?" Alaric did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, like another trap. He knew, if he spoke too boldly, Isolde and Maera would face a new wave of scrutiny. If he stayed silent, they'd resort to violence, probing everyone around him. So he chose what had once taught him: speak a truth, laced with enough distortion that the listener would fill in the rest. "You may tell His Majesty," Alaric spoke calmly, "that the gaze in the night does not belong to one man alone. It spreads. It is the consequence of many people looking at one another, wondering who the traitor is. And His Majesty, he stands at the centre of a shattered mirror. If he keeps hunting for fragments without looking into himself, the break will widen and swallow the court whole." The young priest nodded slightly, as if taking notes. "Whom do you wish to protect?" he asked. But it wasn't interrogation, it was a test. "You offer counsel to one who sits on the throne, and you may confuse him. A confused king will shatter everything." Alaric closed his eyes and breathed gently. "I'm not protecting anyone. I'm only speaking the words you'll hear between the cracks. I don't want the kingdom to fall to pieces because of your blindness. But if you ask me who is pulling the strings, the answer is, His Majesty should look into the mirror he forged himself." The young priest left. There were no whips, no shouted accusations. Several hours later, a messenger returned. "You will be kept near the king. He wishes to hear more. If you have anything else to say, speak it before he begins asking on his own." And things grow more complicated. It was another trap, veiled as a favour. Alaric was placed in a small room, close enough to hear the heartbeat of the palace through its walls, with attendants moving just outside. Now the king wanted to extract the source of the darkness that was unsettling him. He believed that by keeping the one behind a part of the gaze, he could force it to lead him to the rest. The plan now shifted. Alaric, in the role of the reflection source, began to be used like a dull mirror to implant thoughts in the king's mind. Thoughts that seemed to emerge from the king himself. Suspicion of advisors, doubt in friendship, questions about his own loyalty. Meanwhile, from the outside, Alaric tried to send a signal. One night, while Maera was cleaning the adjacent room under the guise of an old janitor, she touched a small box Alaric had hidden beneath a layer of cloth under the bed. While the young priest and the king argued about the object Alaric had revealed, Maera, with familiar movements, slipped a small note from a rag in her basket. An old code symbol, drawn in invisible ink that would only appear when dipped in a special liquid she still kept hidden. She scribbled quickly. "No request for rescue. This is a ploy. King is nearing suspicion. Stay calm. I'll find a way." The note was slipped into the lining of the straw filter used for the king's tea, a risky but necessary method of passing the message. Days later, Isolde received word of a new whisper from the source, via an old courier, the one who used to carry literature for her when she was still a scholar. The words were carefully unwrapped, like the voice of someone trying not to be heard. "Use the reflection as a counter-reflection. Make him believe he is the storm. Don't let him know I'm behind it." However, across the city, what was happening to Isolde and Maera had gone beyond exhaustion and fear. Those who had once been clear-minded now suffered what could be called mild madness. Not total insanity, but a film of memory, history, failure, and death laid over them. They saw reflections of themselves in every step, wondering what was real, what was a mistake. Isolde began seeing lines of text jumping from her notebook. She crossed them out, then again, and finally wrote a reminder to herself. Don't let imagination become the messenger. Don't let fear write the plan. Maera, after Edric's death and the terror of being watched, could no longer control her use of the concoction she'd made to soothe the mind. She added to it herbs her mother had once used to banish the shadows in the head, and the result was visions of Tavin and Roderick appearing each time she closed her eyes. They said nothing, only stood there, silent, eyes full of responsibility. A reminder, we are lost, don't let the next be you. she began acting alone. One night she left her post and went to an old military camp where a soldier once saved by Roderick resided. She believed that if she could stir remorse in him, he would use his minor status to help Alaric. She arrived and told him a half-truth, about the king being stalked by shadows, about the mirror within, about an opportunity to repay a debt. The soldier, carrying a mix of gratitude for Roderick and guilt over fallen comrades, agreed. He tried to reach Alaric through an old air vent, leaving a tiny piece of food marked with a sign from Tavin's grandmother, a way to confirm identity, and told no one. His desire to help became a solitary act. That solitary act was discovered. The young priest, already watching every small shift around Alaric, noticed a change in airflow in the room. A small item had entered from outside, a food fragment not matching the royal diet. Every shadow in the shimmering light was scrutinised, and the soldier, not the cleverest, was caught as he tried to slip away. They didn't kill him right away. Instead, they crushed him, using the images of Roderick and Tywin. They made him see the shadows of those two friends in a dark cell, then asked, "Who can I trust if not the one who speaks?" He broke. In weakness, he let slip a name, Myra. Another knife plunged into their shrinking ranks. The news spread like the musty smell of the dungeon. Myra felt it. She fled, not to Isolde as the old rules dictated, but straight to the place she believed was safe, a small house belonging to the silversmith, who once crafted jewellery for the king, where she hoped to create a counter-trap for the young priest. But when she arrived, the silversmith had already been visited by another. A new member of the king's security network, a face few knew, a man specialised in tracking reflections. She was captured while trying to leave behind a false trail, and this time there was no gentleness. She was dragged into a room full of small mirrors, each one reflecting her image distorted, as if panic itself was being used as an interrogation device. On the other side of the city, Isolde realised she had lost contact with Myra. She tried the old signals, no response. The loss brought deeper panic. The story scrambled, clues became meaningless, and part of her began to believe that Myra had betrayed them. That terrifying idea, fed by sleeplessness and shadows in her room, pushed her into a solo move. She visited an old archivist she had long suspected of disloyalty and forced him to give up information about a new arrival. He, frightened, ran to the palace and reported everything. When the words reached the king, he smiled, not out of joy, but from a strange silence. The traitors have begun turning on each other. I see the light destroy itself. He ordered a hunt for the final reflection, the one he now believed to be the source of the mirror. Meanwhile, something small happened in the background. The captured soldier, whose spirit had been crushed, did not die. He was kept alive, a double-edged blade. Because of his lingering questions, once he awoke, he was moved to another room where an old guard, one who had seen Roderick save a life, approached silently. He had not forgotten the debt. He whispered into the soldier's ear, "If you still have any mercy left, help me retrieve that fragment of shadow. He is not the final traitor." A plea hidden in a sigh of despair. The soldier, weary, agreed. He swallowed that last piece of trust, and on a special night, when the young priest escorted Alaric from his chamber for another dialogue, the soldier, twitching from within, marked an anomaly. A dungeon door left slightly ajar, a strange eye watching through the slit. The escape plan reignited like a pile of ashes reborn. That night, the old guard and the broken soldier delivered a faint breeze. A small knife hidden inside a medicine pouch, a loose cord to unlock restraints, and one of Roderick's old guards, now fallen from favour, living in hiding, promised to help. Alaric was pulled from his cage, chest aching from the force, legs covered in damp dust. They didn't get far. As Alaric reached the ground outside the dungeon, the old guard took an arrow to the shoulder, a signal that the reflection was fleeing. Lights in the castle now flared like the eyes of awakened foxes. They hid in the darkness of an abandoned corridor network. The broken soldier now stood trembling beside Alaric, his eyes no longer simply confused, but carrying a faint kind of resolve. I will repay my debt. But the escape didn't stay silent for long. As they separated, a horse's hooves echoed, metal clanged. And from a rear entrance, a figure emerged. The young priest, not alone. He wore a slight smile. I have held the mirror up too long. Now it reflects back, but I don't intend to let it shatter. When Alaric fled the castle in the chaos of night, he knew there was no turning back as before. The shadows of the fallen clung to him like a poisonous mist, and their whispers were no longer mere reminders. They had become a cold calculation. Every wrong step, every weakening ally, was a new price to pay. The king no longer merely suspected, he acted. The gaze that had once been a crack now became a hunting net. The young priest, after capturing Alaric, did not relent. He understood that the one who offered the mirror could reflect back, and so he began building a counter-system. Watchers observing every silent movement. Petitions transformed into prayers of verification, and chaos diffused like a slow poison into the minds of the middle ranks. Alaric sought a place old enough to mask the scent of blood and fear, a storage house beneath the old bridge where Roderick had once led troops. A few silent figures were there, survivors once saved by Roderick, now living in hiding. They lacked the strength to enact grand plans, but they had enough to shield a weary body. Alaric was injured. The knife wound near his chest had not yet healed, and the pain beat like a drum, reminding him that time was running short. The soldier, whose spirit had once been crushed, now a walking scar, his eyes a mixture of guilt and resolve, was brought to a temporary hiding place, silently bandaged, though not truly free. The old guard, who had once watched from afar as Roderick saved him, came to Alaric and sighed. He, the priest, thinks I've snuffed the source. I know he hasn't, but this time, what do you need to make him believe you're dead? The idea struck like a cold blade. Fake death. Not to surrender, but to become another layer of disguise. If the court believed Alaric had vanished for good, the hunt would ease, the eyes would retreat, and suspicion would close in on other leads. In that moment, Isolde could breathe. Maera might be pulled free or at least reconnected through signal, and Alaric could emerge from death to dismantle the next trap. But to fake death, a cost had to be paid. False information, controlled evidence exposure, and one individual would need to become the sacrificial corpse. The once broken soldier, upon awakening, no longer rambled. He looked at Alaric with dark eyes and said, "If your death saves Maera, then I'll be the bait." Alaric nodded, making no promises, only gripping his hand. A silent vow. Meanwhile, within the castle, paralysis continued to spread. Isolde didn't know whether Maera was alive or broken. Prolonged silence turned suspicion into dangling madness. The question, who betrayed us, became who's still real. She began sending secret messages to a few former trusted contacts, but the fragmentation of their network meant some messages fell into the wrong hands. One of the so-called loyalists, driven by uncertainty, acted on her own. She approached a minor merchant who had once relayed documents for Isolde, asked too many questions, frightened him, and drove him to report to the guards that a new plan is forming. That small sound became another crack beneath their already fragile shell. Maera, imprisoned in a room of mirrors, each tiny pane reflecting her distorted form until she no longer knew what she looked like, was being subjected to spiritual reflections. They didn't torture her with obvious violence. Instead, they used guided meditations, psychological games, ghostly children appearing in sleep, illusions of Tavin and Roderick whispering guilt. Each time she refused to reveal anything, another small mirror would light up, projecting ever more tragic visions. At times, she staggered, nearly surrendering, nearly uttering Isolde's name in exchange for freedom. But a shard of memory, Tavin's eyes as he said, "Don't let the light be exposed by dissecting too deeply," reminded her that betrayal wouldn't save anyone. It would only drive another blade into her comrades' necks. The psychological price reached its peak when Myera was pulled into a staged dialogue, where the young priest placed her before an old photograph, a picture of their group, layered with wax, each face fading into scratches. "Speak," he whispered. "Who freed Alaric? Who holds the whispers? Who still lives?" She remained silent. Then another voice spoke, a deep, gravelly voice unlike any in the palace. A stranger appeared, an aged interim priest, once deemed heretical by the court for healing outside sacred rites, a man Myera had once encountered at the margins while delivering messages for Isolde. He saw through the game. He said nothing to the young priest, but looked at Myera with a gaze that offered a choice: stay silent and be broken, or speak and lose her allies. He left her a small cloth bearing an old symbol, a sign. "I have not forgotten who holds the mirror." It was the first quiet spark in a new series of moves. The old priest hadn't arrived by chance. He had a past with Roderick, who had once saved his kin during a famine, and he had carried a silent debt ever since. Now he positioned himself between the players, able to pull strings just beneath the priest's surveillance, separating a strand of light from what the king believed was the source of reflection. He was a vague ally, but a glimmer of hope. Alaric sent his message using a prepared signal. A black painted jar left in the old market, containing a crumpled note. Feigning death. Isolde, meet at the old bridge in 3 nights. Myra, cling to the old light. The message reached Isolde through a different channel, a former courier, shielded by the old priest. She read it without tears. Beneath her exhaustion and tension, one thing stirred. There is still a path. The fake death plan was put into motion. Word spread that a street vendor had accidentally seen a body floating down the river, clothed like Alaric, battered, bearing signs of a known reflection bearer. The tale reached the court through the usual channels. A minor preacher in the outskirts spoke in his sermon that the one who clouded the king's mind for too long had been swallowed by the water, and the king, in a vague sense of relief, let out his first sigh in ages, though not yet fully at ease. But even the fake death could not still the hunt for long. A seasoned guard, long suspicious, uncovered a detail. Faint fingerprints on the black jar, not Alaric's, but the old soldiers who had helped him escape. That trace triggered a new test grid, and on the night they prepared the next step, a small unit raided the warehouse. Alaric, Myera, informed by the old priest that she could be extracted via disinformation, and the soldiers scattered in chaos. They narrowly avoided being cornered, thanks only to the cover of a group of civilians summoned by the old priest to create distraction. As this chapter closed, 2 truths stood out like twin embers still burning. First, the fake death had bought them enough breath to avoid immediate annihilation. Second, the young priest now had a clearer understanding of the new structure. No longer a mere hidden cell, but a shadow network, capable of morphing, scattering, and feeding misinformation back. He was no longer hunting a man. He was trying to crush the web itself. Alaric lay in the warehouse's shadow, listening to the soft tap of rain on the tin roof, and whispered to the soldier, "We will not win with blades anymore. We will make him reflect so deeply he exposes the core himself." The soldier cradled his bandaged arm, gazing toward the cellar door, where dim light spilled in, and nodded, a soft but resolute determination. "I will repay my debt. But this time, someone must live to tell the tale." The night following the faked death seemed to bring a momentary breath of relief, but everything felt like a taut wire stretched to its limit. One light touch could make the entire structure tremble. This part begins with an unexpected double trap. The young priest hadn't just been tracking Alaric. He had also planted an idea into the king's mind, a piece of advice that no one had asked for, that the mirror bearer might not appear only once. If the eye in the dark was reflecting, perhaps it had transferred to those nearby, so wouldn't it be wise to try a reverse mirror to identify who was watching? The king, already consumed by suspicion and in a ruin, summoned Edric, believed to be dead. And here came the first twist. Edric was not dead. He had been hidden under a cover story fabricated by Isolde and the old priest. He had been used as a decoy corpse to mislead watchful eyes. But now he returned, different. His figure gaunt, his gaze changed, and a strange tremor in his voice. He no longer fully trusted whatever was speaking through him. The king placed Edric in a temporary position nearby, like a pawn to monitor the next reflection source. Meanwhile, in hiding, Alaric received word from the old soldier, a coded signal delivered by placing a cloth scented with Maera's medicine atop a narrow street lamp. The priest is not just hunting, he's opening another door. The mirror now has another layer of glass. Beware the old guard. The old guard referred to a figure from Roderick's hazy memories, once believed loyal, the one who had helped dress Alaric's wounds after his escape. Alaric began to suspect, had that man been turned? They decided to deceive with a reverse trap. Isolde wrote a new story, a letter supposedly sent from the king's own shadow to himself, stating that the reflection source has recognised the role reversal. Whoever is watching you now will be exposed. Use the reverse mirror. The letter was delivered through a vague channel to the young priest, making him believe that the king planned to use Alaric as bait to capture the watcher. The priest immediately reversed the play. He dispatched a former guard to the warehouse where Alaric was hiding, hoping to catch the one watching himself in the mirror. Alaric sensed something was wrong. The old guard appeared in the night, not with noise but with soft, padded steps, like one trained in silence under Roderick. He approached, whispering, "He, the priest, knows. You must leave." But as Alaric turned to flee, the guard grabbed his arm, not to drag him into a dark corner for capture, but to whisper, "I haven't betrayed. Look." He showed a cracked shard of mirror, reflecting a faint image of the young priest in the castle, gazing at a map marked with the warehouse's location. A mirror within a mirror. The next twist, the old guard was still an ally but mentally cursed. By the priest, a psychological surveillance that caused him to see misleading possibilities. He retained fragments of truth and found ways to signal Alaric undetected. They stood in the narrow alley. The old guard spoke quickly. "A false meeting is arranged. The king wants to see if you run or become the next reflection. They'll arrive within an hour. I'll help you fake death again. Let someone else carry your corpse. You disappear eastward. I'll distract them with a false lead." Alaric nodded. When shadows of the patrol squad appeared at the hallway's end, led by a newly assigned eunuch who seemed overly devoted, they staged a scene with an old wooden box posing as Alaric's coffin and rolled it away. The pursuers followed, while Alaric and the old soldier slipped through a wall gap, diving into the depths of an ancient sewer system. Meanwhile, back at the palace, Isolde received word that Edric, now close to the king, had made a baffling move. He calmly led the king to a small chamber where an old ancestor's statue stood. Edric asked the king questions no one had prompted. "Do you truly see that gaze? Or is it merely a mirror making you reflect upon yourself?" The king, overwhelmed by a sense of deception, slipped into a suspended state. And in that moment, Edric, in an unexpected gesture, pulled a small cloth from his sleeve, the same symbol Maera once used, and placed it on the statue's pedestal. Edric whispered, "Look closely. Believe nothing unless it reflects truth on its own." This wasn't a full reversal, but an intermediate twist. Edric, thought to have been reinstated to restrain the king, now planted a new seed of doubt. The idea that the gaze might be something else, something using the king to reflect upon itself. Outside, Alaric and his small band were forced to hide through an abandoned market complex. They thought they had evaded pursuit, but just as they relaxed, a soft laugh echoed from behind. A young voice mixed with the wind. "I thought you were dead." The figure was not an obvious enemy, but a young girl in a pale grey cloak, her face marked with charcoal streaks. She had once appeared briefly one night when Tavin was alive. delivering snippets of information to the group. She had vanished after Tavin's death. Alaric believed she'd been captured or had turned away. Twist. She had survived and become a shadow network of her own. She smiled, producing a small tube with a sealed charm, a signal that the priest is pushing the battlefield to trap the reflection. The king will believe the reverse mirror, and that very mirror will open a door into the secret chamber behind the throne. The tension continued to rise. Alaric decided to gamble. They didn't return to the cellar, but followed the Grey Girl's direction to an old mailroom beneath the castle, where, according to her signal, the young priest was setting up a great mirror to identify the reflection bearer. The objective: plant a piece of false information there, tricking the priest into believing the reflection source had shifted to another traitor, causing him to reveal a weak point in verification. During this, they were caught, not by noisy guards, but by a silent servant, eyes red from sleep deprivation, once the food courier for Roderick. He stood before them without yelling, simply whispered, "Who gave you permission?" Alaric immediately recognised him, a servant trained by the priest to become an intermediary eye, someone who used routine to detect deviations. Next twist, the servant didn't strike. He didn't alert anyone. Instead, he led them down a sealed passage, locked it behind, and softly said, "I owe Roderick. People say you have nothing left to lose. I'll help one more time, but don't let him know I did." He opened a secret door leading straight into the mirror chamber, recently prepared by the priest. And the sight made Alaric's heart drop. A circle of mirrors, each reflecting a different version of the king. A strong monarch, a confused one, a shattered one, and in the centre, the young priest, his hand pressed to one of the reflections, as if shaping it. Now the plan became a trap within a trap. Alaric placed the false message at the centre of the mirror circle, obscuring it under the dim glow of an oil lamp. The priest, who had retreated to prepare the act of pulling that reflection toward the king, sensed the subtle shift, a cold wind brushing across the mirrors. He turned back, and then came the sudden strike. The light flashed, the mirror activated, reflecting an image of Alaric leaping out as if he were the reflected king, startling the priest into a rare moment of hesitation, the first time since he began the hunt that he didn't act immediately. Alaric didn't miss the chance. He lunged toward that hesitation. But just as his hand reached out, a sudden clang rang behind them. Edric stood in the doorway, without warning. He tilted his head with a thin smile. "I believe reflected light shouldn't be used to examine others. It should reflect yourself." The big twist. Edric had not come to stop them. He had come to pull the priest out of the mirror by making the king think that the priest himself was being reflected. A counterplan layered atop a counterplan. The silence following the twist in the mirror chamber didn't last long. It shattered like thin glass under the pressure of a sudden burst, a flurry of lightning strikes without warning. Edric stood between Alaric and the young priest, his gaze a complicated calculation. Not entirely a saviour, nor a betrayer. He was a spinning blade in mid-air, its edge both threatening and shielding. The king stood behind them, his face blank, hands resting on the armrests of the throne as if holding back a secret on the verge of rupture. In that silence, Edric spoke, his voice level like someone reciting a riddle. "Have you ever tried looking into the same mirror you hold up to others? Maybe I'll help you, if you help me." The young priest smiled faintly, but there was a visible crack in that smile. Alaric saw it clearly. He didn't trust Edric. Then again, the king didn't fully trust him either. The reverse mirror that Edric had introduced caused the king to hesitate, to begin wondering, is the priest being reflected, or is he reflecting someone else? And in that moment, Edric lowered his head, whispering a line that only Alaric could hear. "When he sees the reflection of himself, make him see the thing that makes him pay the price." That was the first signal, Edric had not come to rescue anyone. He came to trigger a deeply embedded strike, a psychological trap that would make the priest become the one being watched in the king's eyes. The young priest responded, not with a sword, but by turning his eyes toward the king and softly saying, "You're seeing an image that is not entirely mine. Those who stand behind the mirror can also be looked at." The king nodded slightly. "Show me," he said. Edric stepped forward, as if embodying a reflection, and placed a small mirror shard on the table, the one broken earlier in the mirror chamber, now polished and coated with a dull black oil. He said, "If you truly want to know who is using whom, look closely. But remember, anything that reflects can also cut." The king leaned in toward the mirror, and what happened next made the whole room hold its breath. In the mirror's surface was not just a single image of the young priest, but layers. A robed man, a hand placed upon another reflection, and a shadow behind them both. Edric. He had just set the mirror down as if handing over a piece of distrust to the king, then stepped back, his eyes shimmering with something like an invitation. "See for yourself." The king touched it. A thin smoke rose from the mirror's surface. The images inside shimmered, and the reflection of the young priest seemed to be pulled out, not by force but by magnified doubt. The subtle movements in his face slowed, his eyes no longer certain. That was the trigger of Edric's trap. The priest suddenly saw himself reflected by the king's own suspicions, and in that weakened moment, Edric leaned in and whispered to the king in a near silent voice, a private explanation. "You see now, don't you? Not all reflections are clear. Some are hidden beneath many more layers." Just then a small sound came from the doorway, not the stomp of soldiers but a breeze opening an old cracked door. Isolde. She entered unannounced, eyes sharp like a honed blade, holding a small scroll wrapped in black cloth. A message from the old priest accompanied it. "Don't push further. The mirror has already seen the core. Use reflection to feed reflection." Next twist. Isolde hadn't come to save Alaric. She came to insert another distortion. She unrolled the paper and in front of the king read an invented transcript. In last night's dream, the crown spoke that a trickster was using his own shadow to make the king look at himself. That person is not the priest. That person is the mirror. These words ignited a new suspicion. If the mirror reflects multiple layers, then who placed the mirror? Edric smiled faintly. "Careful," he whispered to Alaric. "Not everyone will leave this room with their intentions intact." This standoff didn't erupt into overt violence. It was a knife-tinted dance. Words planted like mines, glances were the triggers. The king, torn between reflections and riddles, finally gave an order. "Take the priest away. Keep Edric close. And keep that man." He pointed to Alaric. "Here. I want to see who reflects next." Alaric was sealed in the shadows, not bound but unable to leave. Edric leaned in and whispered, "While he's cornered, find the core. If you get it, he'll have no mirror left to use." And just when they thought they'd gained a slim advantage, a jolt shook the entire board. From below, a faint alarm sounded. An old signal code of Roderick's was activated. It rang out like a long-held breath, exhaled from the deep. Something is moving. Not here, somewhere else. Chaos flared outside the castle. Guards running shouted rumours. Someone emerged from behind the council chamber, a person few had noticed from the beginning. It was the old priest. He wore no ecclesiastical robes, just plain clothes, walking with an unhurried gaze. And when he approached the king, he placed a hand on Edric's shoulder. A touch as light as a command. "Reflection has gone too far. People are staring into the core of the mirror. If you continue, it will reflect back onto you." New twist. The old priest wasn't just a vague ally. He was the keeper of an ancient defence point, part of an order long cut off from the crown, but still holding a sharp edge within its structure. He had brought proof. Another mirror shard, undamaged, engraved with the secret insignia of that order. It did not reflect images, it reflected intent. When the king's eyes touched it, he saw not layers of external reflections, but what lay within himself. Accusations, loneliness, the deepest fear. The king stepped back. "Where did you place it?" Edric whispered. "In a place where the reflection can be controlled," the old priest replied, turning to Alaric. "You can use it to make him..." He pointed at the young priest. "Believe what he's holding is the only thing left. When he tries to grasp it, he'll reveal something else." At that moment, a cry rang from the hallway. Myra. She didn't appear as a broken shadow, but as a fractured light. Hair dishevelled, eyes red, but calm to the point of terror. She wasn't chained. She was escorted in by 2 neutral guards. One's convinced by the old priest that bringing her was a necessary dialogue, staged as part of the sequence. Big twist. Myra was no longer imprisoned. While being conditioned in the mirror room, she had hidden a small shard on her person, tampered with the intent mirror, to send a signal. A strange light reflection. A code flashed through a crack in the wall, activating old silent security windows, creating a blind spot enough for her to escape with the old priest's covert aid. She arrived just as the young priest was being pulled into the web of mirrored doubt. She laughed, voice dry. "You think you're holding the mirror, but mirrors can be shattered from the inside." The king turned to the young priest, suddenly cold. "You used me as a canvas to paint everyone else. Who painted you?" For the first time in a long while, the young priest looked disoriented. He looked around. The reflections he once called his watch were now a chain of returning stares. Edric whispered into the king's ear, "Perhaps we should let him reflect himself, and use what he believes is someone else's scheme to reveal his own." Amid the chaos, Alaric acted. He didn't rush the priest, didn't shout. He took out the intent mirror shard the old priest had given him, placed it on a small table, and looked straight at the king. "Your Majesty," he said, "this mirror doesn't reflect what happens outside. It reflects what you fear to admit. If you want to end this chain, start from the only place you think is safe, yourself." The king turned, not in anger but in deep silence. He looked into the mirror, then at Alaric, then at Edric, then Myra, then the old priest, and finally he gave a small nod. "Take him outside." He pointed at the young priest. "I want to hear his final whisper, and if it is a reflection, I will catch it before it catches me." Just as the order was given, a low rumble sounded, not from the sky but from within the castle itself. A secret message from a soldier still alive, one who had been brought back after the night of escape, from a place no one had expected. The something moving was not just physical movement. It was the old security layer being breached, another player slipping into the network, and the hunters were now being hunted. The sound of hooves striking cobblestones outside the gate sliced through the room's breath like a cold blade. Everyone present in the hall, from the king to Edric, from the old priest to Alaric, felt a shift. Not the footsteps of palace guards, but a surge of energy from beyond, carrying with it something that didn't belong to the worn-down order of the court. The great doors opened, and a procession of black-clad figures stepped in. Not royal guards, for they bore no lions or dragons, but a silver insignia, 3 interwoven spirals etched into a round medallion, like an eye opening from within the darkness. The one leading them wore no mask, a middle-aged woman with her hair tied back neatly, eyes the colour of morning fog, and a dull silver cloak embroidered with the image of a serpent coiled around a cloudy mirror. Her followers stepped in silent unison, but even their silence had weight, as if they carried an invisible layer of glass that veiled every gaze. She bowed ever so slightly before the throne, not touching the ground, then turned her face to the king. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice deep and cold as wind from the icy north. "I come in place of a fractured order. I am Warden Aelith of the Vale of Black. I did not come by invitation. I came because the first mirror has reflected too long, and it has begun spawning subsidiary reflections that distort the realm. As whispers rose from behind, Edric smirked. The young priest held his breath, and the old priest studied her with a calculating gaze. A stranger, yet familiar in unclear ways, like a faded reflection from an old mirror. Aelith did not wait for a response. She gestured, and 3 figures in black approached Alaric, Maera, and Isolde, those who stood off to the side, caught in a posture of how to use rather than how to hide. One of them pulled out a parchment sealed with black wax. The seal bore the royal script, the king's own handwriting. "Who sent you?" the king asked, his voice trembling slightly. Aelith held up the letter without opening it. "This letter was sent from the throne," she said, "bearing your signature, requesting the veil of black to repair the corrosive reflection within the court, and protect the throne from any who wield mirrors as weapons. But there is a mark, an addition layered in a different ink, distorting the original intent." The king frowned. "I did not send that. It's a trap." "Or an invitation," Edric whispered. In a swift motion, Isolde pulled a small scroll from her sleeve, the record she had read minutes before, and handed it to Aelith. "If the mirror is now reflecting itself, who will define truth for it?" Aelith unrolled the parchment and retrieved a faint imprint. She lifted a small shard, the mirror of intent the old priest had named, which now shimmered with a difference. Across its surface were carved letters, not of the common tongue, delicate etching revealed only under dim light. She said nothing, placing the mirror shard onto the table, and a chill spread through the room. "I have not come to choose sides," Aelith declared. "I've come to retrieve the mirror that has become too dangerous. The only thing that balances one reflection is another that can gaze into the core. But to obtain it, I need to know who is truly controlling the mirror from within. I propose a temporary accord. Your Majesty, allow me access to the young priest. Adric, show me the reflection you planted. And you," she turned to Alaric, "you walk between. I want to see which mirror your hand has touched." The proposal hung in the air like a sharp thorn between them. The king spoke. "Can you be trusted?" Aelith smiled faintly. "Trust is for those who hold up mirrors without knowing they might rebound." Edric chimed in. "Then who else? The old guardian? The priest? Are you using them or are they using you?" Aelith turned to the old priest and nodded slightly. "I know there's a buried root beneath this. You came now because that root has surfaced. I won't touch him unless he touches the mirror. Now, I request a test." The test was proposed like a perilous marriage offer. The young priest, now under heavier suspicion than ever from the king, must place one of his own reflections before the intent mirror of the old priest for Aelith to observe the interaction. If the reflection he generated warped, it meant his gaze had been manipulated from outside. If it remained intact, the core must be his own. As tension stretched taut, from a low, dark corner came a whisper. "Don't fully trust." The speaker was none other than Edric. He stepped forward, placed a small black lacquered box on the table, opened it, and drew out a weathered leather-bound journal. Inside was a hurried entry by Tavin, written just before his death. "If the mirror begins to look back at you, twist it. Someone else has placed a lens over it. They know who's watching. They are the third image." Twist. Aelith was not entirely foreign. She had once been among the keepers of the lens within the old order from which the priest was a remnant. Every reflection had once passed through her hands. She had been cast out for interfering too deeply with the balance of intent, and now returned not to heal, but to test what had changed. The young priest, his expression fraying with doubt, raised his hand toward his own mirror shard. The light within it began to flicker, then stabilized. Reflections rippled, an image of Alaric, a Maera emerging from shadow, a fading Edric, then himself, his eyes flaring with an inexplicable hue. The intent mirror, beside it, remained still. Aelith tilted her head. He is not entirely in control, she murmured. He holds a shard, but someone else, someone I've yet to see clearly, is hiding behind the shadow of the reflection. That one might be the origin of the mirror's self-questioning. The king, in a silence so deep one could hear the ticking of the palace clock, gave his decree. Temporarily accept the accord. Edric, keep watch. Alaric, go with Aelith. I want to know who the third is. Priest, guard the shard. Isolde, record. Maera watched from the rear. She remained at a distance, but in her eyes burned a fire. Not only of caution, but of something igniting. They had just been pulled into one of the deeper spirals, and now was the time to choose. Use Aelith as a shield, or uncover the spear hidden beneath her offer. What none of them knew was that while the accord was being accepted, something else had crept in from behind. The soldier who had once helped Alaric, whom the priest believed was fully cut off after interrogation, now bore a tiny insignia placed by an unknown hand. A reversed engraving of the snake and mirror sigil, the mark of the third faction Tavin had warned of. The soldier stood in the hallway, eyes wide, whispering into the wind. It's not just them, something is watching behind the watcher. The final twist of this chapter wasn't a loud declaration, but a touch unnoticed by all. As Aelith leaned in to examine the reflection, the old priest subtly rotated the intent mirror by the smallest angle, just enough to alter how the light returned the image. A shift only those who had seen a mirror crack would recognise. The core did not reveal itself. Instead, a new dark patch emerged within the young priest's reflection, a void no one had anticipated, and that void began to spread like ink bleeding into water. No one in the room had breath left to speak. The third presence lay beneath the stone floor, within the dim violet glow of an ancient crevice, like a long imprisoned whisper finally released. Alaric sensed it before he saw it, a fine vibration, like the first touch on a still body of water. The old priest bowed his head and laid a hand upon the cold ground. It's not merely an observer, he murmured. It's a reflection that replicated itself from what you call intent. It knows the cracks, knows who watches whom, and is trying to turn every gaze into a trap. Aelith did not hesitate. She turned to Alaric and whispered, "Come with me. The third hides within the core of the shattered mirror. It is not on the surface. If I can reach the origin, I can force it to reflect itself." They descended a spiral staircase, their lanterns extinguished by a torchbearer of the veil of black, plunging the descent into shifting pools of darkness. At the end of the corridor, a small stone door swung open when the old priest touched a carved sigil, an eye with scales of water. Inside was a narrow shaft, and a steep stair leading down. The air smelled of ancient mirrors, not glass but something thick like liquid, cold, laced with both reflections and whispers. As they stepped down, a chamber carved beneath the earth revealed itself. Low ceiling, moss-covered rock walls, and at the centre, a circular basin. Its surface didn't reflect like a regular mirror, but resembled a pool of pitch-black water, with violet mist rising from it in glimmering threads. In the middle of the pool rose a shape, a mass undefined, seemingly woven of both light and shadow, pulsing as if inhaling the room itself. This was the mirror heart, the reflective core. Tavin had once described vaguely, when the mirror begins to doubt, look for what within it refuses to be seen. And standing by the pool, the light shimmering around her as though it avoided her garments, was the one behind it all, Seraphine. Believed by all to have vanished, she was a slight figure, silver hair cascading like smoke over her shoulders, her eyes not looking outward, but inward, as if reading the reflection of every mind. She was not bound. She smiled, a smile without warmth, and the violet light on the water flickered with each gesture of her hand. "You're early," she said, her voice softly echoing, clinging to the ears like the glide of a blade. "I thought I had more time to wait out your game, Edric, Alaric, and your royal guests. But time, like everything else, reflects itself. Do you know what this is? It's not merely a tool. It is the residue of hundreds of thousands of gazes. Those who believed, doubted, betrayed, and were betrayed. I call it the mirror heart because it devours truth and gives it back in countless forms. Edric stepped forward, no longer weary but sharp-eyed. Seraphine, you sowed chaos to awaken it. What do you want? She closed her eyes, as if listening to an echo from deep within the pool, then opened them. Her reply came as a vague malice. I want what you fear most. I want to show the king his core reflection, to strip him bare, and in that moment I will choose. I can let him save himself, or I can let the mirror consume him. Aelith stepped forward, opening a small silver talisman shaped like a serpent coiled around a mirror, a symbol of the Veil of Black. She whispered an ancient word. The light around her swirled, forming a veil between the mirror heart and Seraphine. I didn't come to help you shatter the realm, she said, but I also won't let you bind it forever. I propose this, one chance to reverse. I'll let you gaze into the core, but I will place another reflection inside. If you reflect it back, I'll know who controls it. Seraphine laughed. You always played with mirrors, Aelith, but mirrors remember. They do not forget what you once placed upon their surface. She raised a hand, and from the pool rose an image. Alaric, not his current self, but a fragmented reflection. Shards of broken memory swirling, some trying to reconnect. You carry a piece of me in your very gaze, she said to Alaric. I planted something there long ago, a thread of doubt to make you believe you were between silences. You never knew. But the mirror inside you was looking back. A shock surged down Alaric's spine. It felt as if an echo from within his chest could reflect outward, questioning what was real and what was manipulation. And at that moment, Maera stepped forward, holding a shard of the Mirror of Intent. She swiped it across Alaric's reflection. The image in the water wavered. The scattered pieces trembled and fell still. Don't let it touch you again, she whispered, her gaze fierce with resolve. Isolde, standing beside her, produced another sheet of paper, a script she had prepared, a tale not about a king, but about someone who tried to fix the mirror and was undone by its gaze. She tore off a piece and let it fall onto the pool's surface. The mirror heart quivered, a sound rising like the collective sigh of a crowd, and a new light emerged, an image of the king, but behind him loomed a larger shadow. Not anyone else, but the third presence, who had touched Intent long ago, now partially revealed. A member of the royal lineage, a man whose name had been lost, an old advisor, one the old priest had avoided naming but never denied. Councillor Myron, presumed dead in a mirror collapse incident years ago. That's him, the old priest whispered. He didn't fully die. He dissolved into the mirror heart, and what remained of him became an unerasable core. If I shatter it, the entire mirror will fracture. If I leave it intact, he continues hiding behind reflections. Seraphine crossed her arms. I didn't come to return what's finished, she said. I came to make the king see himself. I will show him who Myron is, but he must choose. To truly see, or to shut his eyes and continue. And if he chooses to see, I will take what I need. Perhaps it's what he's hiding. Perhaps it's a piece of the kingdom's soul. Edric, blood trickling down his hand from a fresh cut, earned while fending off one of the summoned reflections, looked to the king. You want the truth about what's reflecting you, but how much truth will it take to kill you? The king said nothing, stepping toward the mirror heart. The figure of Miren within the pool twitched, then began to surface. 1 second, 2, then paused, as if something within Miren was hesitating, a part of him feeding off being seen, and a part tormented by exposure. Aelith tilted her head. This time, she said, we don't just reflect. We choose who faces whom. I pose a question to the reflection. I will use you as the king's mirror. He won't know he's identifying himself. Maera looked at Alaric, then to the old priest. If we use that core as the hammer, The one who stands between can brace it, but if it breaks, then I will have nothing left to hide behind, the old priest replied. But I'll also finally see who etched the first crack. The king reached out and touched the water. A chill spread through the entire room. Miren's image in the pool recoiled, then unfolded. Not a blur anymore, but a clear face. A man once trusted as a wise counsellor, now bearing hollow eyes, laced with old regret. And beneath that, a shadow of buried ambition. "I choose to see," he said, and his voice carried the weariness of one who's been observed too long. Seraphine smiled as if she had already won something. "Then I will take what I need. Let me show you the accomplice. But remember, one gaze can also be a trap. Once you know, the mirror will no longer reflect just you. It will reflect those who look at you." The violet light shattered like a crack in space, and the entire underground chamber suddenly became unstable. No longer stone, no longer bound by fixed time. The mirror heart roared from within, not a sound, but a vibration that pierced the spine, causing reflections to appear not only in the pool, but inside their minds. Miren, with a face of pain, regret, and fractured ambition, appeared clearly. But behind that image, something else rose. An older depth, unclear, like a gaze no one had ever directly seen, only felt through a distorted silence. "That's not just Miren," the old priest muttered, his hand clutching the shard of reflected intent. Something underneath hollowed him out and layered itself atop. An older core, one who placed mirrors atop mirrors. Seraphine smiled, as if hearing a melody only she could understand. "Now you see it," she said to the king. "That's him, the one who made vision a law, then sealed the law with doubt. Miren is the surface. What lies beneath? It knows what causes the gaze to doubt itself. It doesn't want to be named. It lives in the in-between, in what you call intent." The king was speechless. On his face was an inward recoil, as though seeing wasn't liberation but a binding, knowing, and never being able to unknow. "If I look," he whispered, "what can I keep? And if I don't look, what will I live with that remains hidden?" Edric didn't take his eyes off the image in the water. "You chose to see, but what part will enter you? And what part will sink its teeth?" Aelith raised her hand, drawing a line of doubt. "Your Majesty, to control a reflection, a lure is needed. A piece of the mirror must be exchanged. Is it something you wish to use as a shield, or as a blade?" Isolde stepped back, then forward again, offering another sheet of paper. Upon it, not judgment but a whisper she had prepared long before the mirror heart erupted. A sequence of questions encoded in the handwriting of Tavin, Isolde, and herself. "If you take the truth without a price," she read, "then the reflection will reclaim what you hold. If you give a part of your vision, the vision will not break you, but reflect back the one behind." Maera whispered to Alaric, "I can help you hold it back, but you must agree the shard you carry, the piece of the mirror heart inside you, will not just protect. It will clamp onto whatever tries to emerge from beneath." Alaric looked down at his hand. The reflected intent shard glowed in the dark, echoing a part of the mirror heart that had clung to him for ages. That was why he had seen Tavin, Roderick, and all the silent shadows. That was why he had survived. "I won't let it consume the king," he replied, "but if I use it to break, what will rise in its place?" The old priest extended his hand, adding another sigil to the mirror shard. Whispers trembled from deep within. Not a single voice, but many. Those whom Miren had brought down, forgotten advisors, souls crushed under reflection. "It no longer reflects one man. It reflects a system. If I break it, I expose not just Miren, but whatever fed him. If I preserve it, I buy it time to regrow." Silence stretched tight like fishing wire, and then unexpectedly another twist arrived from behind. Aelith, who had been neutral from the start, slowly withdrew a small wooden box. Inside was a black stone, Not ordinary stone, but a shard of original mirror from the Veil of Black, what they called the inscribed glass. It didn't reflect images, it etched intent, keeping what was placed within it. "I didn't come to offer a free choice," she said. "If you wish to look, Your Majesty, let the inscribed glass retain part of the gaze. The rest, I will take and offer you the reverse reflection, give you an exit. But to earn that exit, a sacrifice must be made, a fragment of the viewer's memory, or a piece of what is being held." The king looked into the mirror heart, then down at the image of Myron, opening wide. At last he drew a small knife from his robe, not to harm anyone, but to cut. He lightly sliced 2 fingers, letting a drop of blood fall onto the inscribed glass. The king's blood, combined with the priest's runes and Isolde's script of the mind, caused the black mirror to quiver. "I will set a boundary to the vision," he said. "I will pay the price, but the exchange must be this. If something rises from beneath, it will be named. It cannot hide. I will know who placed it there, and who concealed it." Seraphine leaned slightly, her eyes deep like whetstone. "You think you control something? You've just given it the power to reflect the giver back." A surge of pressure burst from the pool. Myron was no longer a fading shadow, he was halfway drawn out, the fragmented parts erupting into small, human-like forms like torn pages of old stories. But beneath it, whatever lay deeper still refused to show its face. Instead, it sent a slow pulse, a warning, a shard of memory. "You are not the first to see. You will not be the last to break." Suddenly, from the stairwell a clamour erupted. Galloping hooves shattered the subterranean stillness. Figures in black, not from the Veil of Black, but another faction, marked by the emblem of an inverted serpent, rose. They broke through the stone door, storming inward. The Eyes of Forgetting, a silent sect that believed the mirror heart should not be destroyed but nurtured, for within it resided disciplined oblivion and the power of the reflected. Their leader, a young man with a hieroglyph carved into his iris, offered a cold smile. "You are choosing. I will take what remains." Another twist. Before anyone could react, Myra seized the inscribed glass, already stained with royal blood, and slammed it onto the surface of the pool. A small explosion echoed like a clenched heart. Hatum Bahayi. Violet light shifted suddenly to a washed-out white. Not the dawn of truth, but a collapse of reflection. The mirror heart recoiled, and within that recoil, a part of Myron was yanked upward, not by the king's will or Aelith's intervention, but by something else. A rebound from the deeper third presence, responding to the king's cut. Edric was thrown back, his gaze darted from Myra to Seraphine. "What did you let him touch?" he asked. Seraphine did not look away from the pool. "I showed him what it means to be seen," she replied. "Now you'll see what it means to be reflected. I didn't just open the core, I installed a new window in it. It will choose who passes through." Amidst the chaos, Alaric felt the reflection within him surge. The shard Seraphine once said lived inside him, now cried out like it was being squeezed. He gripped the stone wall to resist being drawn in. Tavin's voice echoed in his mind. "Don't let the mirror take you. Use it to hold. Hold the king. And hold what's still alive." A scream tore through the chamber. The old priest collapsed to his knees, raising his hand. The reflected intent shard shimmered, then cracked. A small fracture. From it a black light, not wholly evil, not wholly pure, spilled forth, wrapping around Myron's fragmented reflections, pulling them in like a trap. "He doesn't want to be broken completely," the priest murmured. "He's trying to patch himself, and whatever's beneath is pulling him back to preserve him." The leader of the Eyes of Forgetting stepped forward, his hand brushing the pool's surface. "I didn't come to destroy. I came to tame," he said. "If the vision breaks, I will take a piece, and I will teach it who its master is." The king turned to him, a cold bead of sweat trailing down his cheek. "You want to turn the reflection into a new king?" he asked. I only want to prevent it from consuming the one who looked into it, the man replied. Which of you still has the power to choose? Suddenly, Edric spun toward Alaric. Another twist. He handed him a small shard, not from the inscribed glass, but a sliver from the old priest's mirror, secretly removed. Here, he said. If you won't use it to break, use it to hold. He doesn't have just one core. He has too many eyes. Place it on the king. Let the king see, but don't let him be seen. Alaric took the shard, and at that instant, a burst of light erupted from the pool like a violent jolt. Miren screamed, not a single cry, but a cacophony of ancient echoes. Something deeper in the mirror heart opened a rift. Within that gap, a faint figure emerged. Not someone everyone knew by name, but the first. The one who wove the first mirror. The one legends called the Keeper of the Gaze. An entity of pure doubt, buried at the core of all reflection. He did not speak. He appeared like a silent challenge. A harsh silence blanketed the chamber as the shadows of the erasers descended, their boots striking the damp stone. Each step was a pulse from the mirror heart, the sound of water rippling like an invitation. Choose. Alaric could feel the weight of the blood-stained royal mirror, heavy in his palm. Every cracked vein on the inscribed glass seemed to etch an unspoken question. To break or to preserve? The king stood silently by the pool, his hands resting on the arms of a makeshift throne erected there. Before him, Seraphine smiled, as though relishing the climax of a grand performance, while Aelith stared intently at the violet flames dancing on the water's surface. The old priest had bowed his head, his shoulders trembling as if trying to carry the burden of every choice being made. You chose the mirror, Tavine's whisper rang once more in Alaric's mind, this time clear as a summons. Hold it up, and show him that the mirror cannot consume itself. Alaric's gaze flicked to Miren in the pool. He was thrashing, clawing at the bubbles like a man tormented between two monstrous winds. Behind Miren, the shadowy outline of the first one grew more defined, silent but immense, and just nearby, Edric was keeping the king's eyes from blinking, as though reminding him not to be pulled into the theatre of it all. Suddenly, Alaric lifted his hand, not with a blade but with the mirror, raising it to the level of the king's eyes. The water lapped softly, as if approving the act. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "Look into this, not with the blade or with doubt, but with your own eyes." The king furrowed his brow, drew a long breath, and turned his gaze toward the mirror. In that moment no one could hear anything, a silence more profound than any sound. The mirror heart ceased its roar, the violet light drawing inward around the black glass. Miren in the pool froze, his eyes wide as if realizing for the first time he was being seen. Then, with the shimmer of the king's blood as catalyst, the etched veins on the inscribed glass suddenly lit up. A streak of white light spread across the mirror's face, not reflecting any one face, but light from the mirror itself, radiating like fire. All the depths were swallowed in that glowing mist. The erasers stepped back, blaming each other, as if fleeing from a truth that could no longer be denied. Aelith whispered, "You've lit the mirror with the king's blood. It cannot consume itself now." Seraphine's voice was low. "What once devoured truth will not devour me today." She stepped to the pool, placed her hand on the surface, and in an instant, that white light sealed like a lock. The mirror heart surged, then slowly dimmed, returning the chamber to a deep, undisturbed darkness. Miren sank to the bottom of the pool, vanishing into the black water. For the first time since part 1, he had nothing left to cling to. "You've done it," the old priest murmured. "I heard its final breath." The king exhaled, slumping back onto the throne. "What happens next?" he asked. Edric replied, "We'll clear the remaining reflections, but first we must rebuild the kingdom from a vision that cannot be broken. Truth." Aelith nodded. "The veil of black will help, but I demand one promise, that this mirror," she gestured to the inscribed glass in Alaric's hand, "is never turned into a weapon. It must remain in the hands of one who will not use it to destroy." Maera stepped forward, her voice firm. I will keep it, and I'll hide it in a place where only those who understand sacrifice can find it. Alaric handed her the mirror. In that moment from above, a trumpet sounded. The herald of a kingdom in chaos. Loyalist forces under royal command were dispatched to search every corner. They began pouring into the stairwell, clearing smoke and mist from the halls. A week passed since the night the Mirror Heart was temporarily sealed, and the kingdom was no longer at peace, not because of war from without, but because of something quietly spreading through every strand of information. Truth was being unravelled, rearranged, examined, and doubted. The king sat on the throne with a different gaze, not one of confident rule, but of a man who had seen the core, knowing that the shadow not only reflected him, but could also nurture collapse if someone made the wrong move. Edric was his eyes, the old priest was the anchor holding shaken foundations, Isolde was the one recording the tale. Unfolding turns that made people both believe and doubt. Aelith and the Veil of Black stood beside like inspectors, not fully trusting, not fully withdrawing. Maera kept the inscribed glass, the object that was both dagger and shield. And Alaric, after the night of facing the mirror, bore within him something else. A fractured reflection. Seraphine had once hinted at. Something inside him still swayed, while Tavin whispered like a shadow demanding balance. They did not celebrate. The success was a thin cushion over a new snare. The king ordered the formation of a secret council, the Balance Council. Its official members were Edric, the old priest, Isolde, and an unofficial representative nominated by Aelith, a former monk exiled from the monastery for recording forbidden truths, a man who called himself Master Mer. He said little. He arrived, placed his hand on the inscribed glass when Maera brought it out, and whispered, "It holds. I will sense what is placed within, what is taken, what is given." Two open problems lay before them. First, the Mirror Heart had not been entirely destroyed. Myron had receded, but the core of the first one still lay beneath, waiting for a chance to resurface. Second, the structure of self-reflective gaze had now triggered a kind of contagious pathology. Some in the court began to see reflections that were displaced from themselves, constantly doubting their own perception, from servants to high officials, slowing decision-making and sometimes unconsciously sabotaging processes. It became known as the reflection sickness. Those who believed they were safeguarding the truth were destabilized by realizing they were being watched, adjusting themselves to the point of losing their center. The Balance Council met in a hidden chamber beneath the royal library, where old scrolls were wrapped in black cloth. Aelith spoke first. "I kept my promise. The inscribed glass is not a weapon, but you, Your Majesty, need someone to hold it. Someone who will not let it become a lens that suffocates. Who among you dares to keep part of the truth without letting it devour the soul?" The king didn't answer immediately. He looked down at the table where the court's map was spread out and said, "I need to know what still lives. Beneath. I want answers. Is there still a piece of Myron? What is the first one? And who is being influenced without knowing it?" Isolde opened a series of notes. She said, "Those deemed insufficiently lucid share a common trait. They look into small water reflections of themselves, and that gaze becomes fragmented into prolonged confusion. Some say they hear whispers in their head, not from others but distorted versions of themselves. That's a sign of the first one probing for its next open channel." The old priest added, "It clings to thoughts. It doesn't live directly within anyone, but it plants a seed of doubt large enough for the person to reveal themselves, then uses that reflection to interact with the system. If we track every individual, we'll push it into multiple fractures, but doing so will also plunge the court into deeper chaos." Edric continued, "I can't let something crawl through unchecked without clear evidence. Miren was drawn away. If he returns, it won't be in his former form. The first one isn't just a memory. It's a rule of distortion. We need a trap. Make it reveal itself in a different shape. Then lure it into a place we control. Myra placed the inscribed glass in the centre of the table as a symbol. Master Mer drew out a silver chalice, poured into it a drop of the king's blood, saved from the previous inscription, then lightly touched the glass. His whispered incantation made the inscribed glass tremble, a gentle glow, not bright, reflecting not images but sensations. Who had seen, who was holding, who had tried to hide. If I place part of the mirror in a designated channel, he said, I can detect a stray reflection as a discordant tremor. I can say, that is not you. The first plan of the new chapter was outlined, to create a controlled reflection network. They would distribute the inscribed glass in small layers, not just in the palace, but discreetly spreading lightly treated fragments to frontline outposts, to small temples where souls, once most intensely watched, had prayed. These fragments, connected through coded signs, written by Isolde, would form a subtle field, preventing those affected by the first one from hiding behind natural layers of doubt. When a reflection was caught, it would be turned into bait, brought into a mirror-lined room, set against a conjured illusion, and forced to reflect its origin. In other words, make whatever was using the reflection expose itself. To implement this, they needed refined bait. Edric suggested using someone deeply afflicted by the reflection sickness, a young overseer named Alvin, who just the week before had confessed to the king that he saw the entire court as pairs of eyes. Alvin was brought in, not imprisoned, but treated as a trial subject. Myra whispered to him, I'll place a layer of reflection on you. When you see yourself incompletely, others will see the misalignment. The first one won't be able to resist touching you. On a misty night, in a sealed chamber, Alvin was placed among 3 small mirrors, each embedded with a shard of the inscribed glass in its corner. Their faint lights formed a small triangle. Master Murph began chanting ancient spells. Aelith maintained the boundary, and Isolde recorded every shift in breath, every twitch of the eye, every whisper. Alvin opened his eyes, and in the flickering light he saw himself, but not a stable image. Versions of himself twitched, looped. Then faint light etched strange letters on his skin. Symbols of the first one appeared and faded. Something in Alvin's mind responded. Not with words, but with a subtle vibration that filled the room, like when a string is pulled too tight and the whole instrument resonates. Hold steady, the old priest whispered. Don't let him pull back. Let whatever is inside reveal itself. Outside in the palace, an old eunuch who once had secret dealings with Roderick, who had once concealed a message about Edric, suddenly approached Isolde. Something strange, he said with a trembling voice. One of the Northern Count's servants has begun speaking to his mirror. He says nothing aloud, but his eyes change. He stares at no one, and then he wrote one word. I know. A subtle twist. The first one had sent reflections through the remaining gaps, not only to coax self-disclosure, but to attempt steering authority over those seeking it. It didn't just hide, it cast out bait to confuse, making characters doubt whether they were the attacker themselves, creating a spiral where it became harder to tell who controlled whom. When Alvin reached the breaking point, an old image of Myron appeared in his mirror, but not quite Myron. It was a construct stitched from preserved fragments in the mirror heart, a composite reflection assembled to test focus. He smelled memories of the past, heard torn promises, and in that chaos the shadow of the first one pulled hard, trying to twist Alvin's gaze into a direct channel down to the core. Isolde pressed her pen to the page, about to write, "It has revealed itself." But Edric pulled her back and whispered, "Wait. If it reveals itself naturally, we'll know what feeds it. If we rush, we'll give it a piece to heal with." Then something broke, not in Alvin but behind them, at the room's slightly open door. A former soldier of Roderick, long thought to have vanished, entered quietly, without a word, simply standing at the threshold. His arrival was the second rupture that froze the room. He hadn't come to rescue. He He laid a piece of worn cloth on the table, a sign of a deep hole opening in the reflection network, a place where the first one had begun to spread in the form of a secondary line. He whispered, "It's trying to reroute. Pull something out before it takes the whole channel." As the door to the testing chamber closed behind Roderick's former soldier, the air seemed to be pulled deeper into everyone's lungs. The whispers in Alaric's mind were no longer from Tavin or the desiccated remnants of the past. This time it was a voice without origin, fused between the infinite and the intimate, speaking slowly like a prophecy. "I am drawing near. Those who hold the mirror will be the first to be seen." The Balance Council froze. The plan to trap the first one had to change, not just by pulling the core out using reflective bait, but by using their own trust and suspicion as a net that would naturally tighten around what lay hidden. Edric turned to Isolde and whispered, "Right, I need a greater phrase, not just revealed, but who made it reveal. We won't hold it up as a lantern, we will make it expose itself by thinking it's the one in control, not us." Isolde nodded, her hand gliding over parchment, sketching out a reverse reflection pattern. A fictional tale of a wealthy official cornered by doubt, believing he was the origin of all gazes in court, then passed it to the old priest for psychological tuning. The goal, to provoke the first one. If it was peering through channels of doubt, let it see a new centre, a fabricated identity born from over-analysis, a trap to isolate the hidden core behind the mirror. Thamer gently placed a small amount of the king's blood on another shard of mirror, then recited an old incantation that caused the faint light to vibrate like a silent bell. "I will place a quiet zone," he said. "When the first one touches the false centre, I will know which path it takes. I won't catch it directly, but I will force it to reflect back onto itself." Maera whispered into Alvin's ear, the man still lying still after the first experiment, his mind wavering between confusion and clarity. "When you look back at yourself," she said, "show me what you see, but don't dare to speak. I'll use it to weave the false channel. That thing will believe it's in control, but it will be walking straight into the net." Alvin, eyes dazed, nodded slowly. He didn't fully understand he was the bait, but in the chaos within him, there was a flicker. If something had taken his piece, then recognizing even a piece of that could become a weapon. They split into two groups. One remained in the mirror room with Alvin, adding further unstable layers, forcing the first one to react if it wished to focus its gaze on the new signal. The other, led by the old priest and Roderick's former soldier, slipped away in secret to sweep for secondary channels. The first one might be using to spread. Lesser clerics, haunted servants, paranoid courtiers, shadowy library corners where old tales of Myron and the first mirror had once been hidden. By day the court functioned with a veneer of restored order, but beneath that a new trend emerged. A few gazes were snuffed out, those who had seen their reflection being pulled backward, as if by an invisible turning force. It was the first sign. The first one hadn't been drawn out. It retaliated by shutting down partial channels, causing those closest to it to lose their sense of discernment, spiral into self-doubt to the point of paralysis, or become carriers of false reflections to deceive others. On the third night after the trap had been set, a subtle shift occurred. In Alvin's chamber, the reflection of himself in the mirror suddenly peeled away a thin new layer. Not another false Myron, but a new face, shifting and murmuring, resembling someone long forgotten in court history. Isolde recognised the symbols appearing on its skin as an ancient variant tied to the erased bloodline of the recorders, those once tasked with chronicling the truth, but later condemned to forget in order to protect royal secrets. "It's trapping the trap," she whispered. "It's not just using doubt. It's using what we've forgotten to form a new core." Just as they were about to initiate the pull phase to force Alvin into dialogue with the new apparition, a soft knock came at the chamber door. Roderick's old soldier, unannounced, entered, pale-faced, clutching a torn piece of paper. He handed it to Edric. On the paper was a shaky line of writing. "It doesn't want to be caught." It moved. "Do not let the mirror within you be exposed." The twist. The first one was no longer reflecting into Alvin. It had tested another method, embedding sensation into someone else, someone within the Balance Council. Edric felt it, his eyes slightly glazed. "Which of us caught the gaze and didn't know it?" he asked, turning to the old priest. The old priest didn't answer right away. He placed a hand to his forehead, eyes closed as if listening to a deeper rhythm beneath the reflections. "It didn't take everything," he said. "It made a part of me, a part of my vigilance, into a reflection. If I look, I see myself being watched. If I don't, I'm led. It's trying to forge a new middleman from my own trust. Aelith proposed a new idea. If it's using us as prisms, let's reflect it back. I'll offer it a false lure. A version of the Balance Council will be constructed. Edric, a false Edric, will be positioned with slight inconsistencies marked by Isolde. The first one will believe it's found a new core gazing upon itself, and it will touch. When it does, we'll sever. We'll use that moment to insert something, freedom, into it, making it question what's watching it." The false identity plan began. A false Edric was constructed using one of his old subordinates, trained to mimic his gestures, dressed and briefed by Isolde and the old priest. They staged a fake scenario, the king considering a minor decision, a discussion with the Northern Count about altering tax policy. The false Edric appeared slightly late, gave advice just off from Edric's usual style, and left behind a small object marked with the Balance Council's sigil. The first one, drawn to this new reflective image, began to stir movement in Alaric. A tugging sensation as if someone were pulling a string from behind, though the source was unclear. At that moment, Alvin, kept in the mirror chamber, saw the figure of the recorder return, but this time not in menace. Instead whispering, "Place within me what you want remembered. Tell me who put me in the reflection. I will give you nothing else." Alvin responded with a faint nod, agreeing to record something with intent, and a small needle was inserted into his arm, a marker enabling his reflection apparatus to capture a transfer fragment of the first one, instead of letting it escape. The next strike, the first one, believing it had found its new central figure, surged forth with all its false reflection layers and dove straight into the trap. Light from the Kinkak fragments around the chamber converged into a central point, and Thamer released a binding incantation, a thread that temporarily tethered the reflection in a ring of white light. It wasn't destroyed, it was held, convulsing, and from within came a rumble like the breath of 1,000 intoxicated souls. A deeper voice echoed in Alaric's mind. "You think you've defined me. I am only turning back. I am what you do not see." Suddenly something snapped. Not the binding circle, but the perspective of the false Edric. A subtle deviation in motion that made the king, watching from afar, tilt his head. "Edric?" the king asked, his eyes narrowing. The false Edrics played the role of the reflection being scrutinised, but that brief silence was enough. The king gave the order to halt, and in that instant the first one, trapped in the circle, had no time left to hide. A fragment of its deeper essence, a piece of the first one, never named, burst out. Not a whisper, but a rasping, choking laugh. A realization revealed. "I am not just reflection," the voice echoed, low and resonant from within the white light. "I am what takes hold of the gaze and bends it, so people think they are the ones who hold it." The old priest blinked. "That's the trace. I can pull it out." Isolde readied her pen, but Edric grabbed her hand. "Don't. If we act too early, it will return. It will use what we call the reverse reflection to forge a new channel." Alaric, his palm tense, whispered to Myera, "If I hold it here, I'll pull the core out. If I let go, it will reclaim what it gave me. How do I know which part is the trap?" Myra answered in a single sentence. I'll hold your gaze. Don't let it gaze back. The chapter ends at the precise moment of hold or release. The first one is bound, but its deeper core has begun. To touch a form of self-awareness, not merely a reflection of doubt, but an active, questioning mirror. It's asking in return, demanding freedom to be fully seen. The Balance Council can destroy it now and sacrifice the newly formed reflection network. Or wait longer, knowing that with every minute, a part of themselves is being drawn into its gaze. The decisive moment was bound to the air like a taut string stretched to its limits. The first one was held within the circle of white light, a pupil nested within a pupil, a reflection resisting its own reflection. And deeper still, the core was rising like a shadow longing to emerge. The mind-balanced society stood around, each like a spear pointed toward the same spot, yet none certain whom they were piercing. We only pull out a part, the king spoke, his voice not commanding but a calculated sigh. If we destroy the whole, whatever lies beneath won't be torn out. It will surge upward, self-heal, and retaliate. We take a fragment, force it to reveal itself, then bind it into silence. Who will be the bait? Edric, who had nearly been pushed into the false reflection earlier, stepped forward. I'll be the one in between, he said. Let it latch onto me. If the first one sees me as the centre, I'll make it reflect back on itself by letting it think it's taking over. Isolde set her pen down, a flicker of painful clarity in her eyes. If it touches you too deeply, it will leave a mark. I'll record it. I won't let that mark become its anchor again. The old priest closed his eyes, pressed his hand against the engraved glass, then lowered it. I can't let it fully imprint on you, Edric. One part will be implanted, and that part will always be watched. But if I wrap another part around it, he pointed at Alaric, then maybe I can preserve something as a safety door. Myra stepped in, tilting her head toward Alaric. You carry something from deep within. If I pair that part with what it's about to leave in Edric, I can create a counterweight, a small mirror it must pass through before moving forward. But it will cost something. Alaric responded without hesitation. Give me the information. When it tries to ask, who are you, I'll return, who are you that made me? They prepared. Edric sat in the centre of the light ring, with a small engraved glass behind him. The false reflections woven by Isolde and Aelith formed a frame to contain the spread. Myr held a vial of water from the old source, steeped in the king's blood, a marker that truth is spun and bound together. Alvin, still the trembling bait, was pulled away to prevent interference. The old priest chanted softly, and the light around Edric began to rotate slowly, as if opening a mirror within a mirror. Begin, said the king. Edric closed his eyes. The first one sensed the bait. A shard of ordinary gaze shattered into confidence, somewhere between trust and doubt. It slithered forward, trying to touch Edric through a soft vibration, attempting to fill the void of control. Then something reflected back. Edric didn't scream. His breath shifted, like a rhythm being stretched. Inside, the image of the first one appeared not just in the light before him, but as a deep current in his mind, brushing against memories, habits. Isolde wrote. The ink sank with each stroke, yet glowed under faint light. A tale of one who thought he held the gaze, only to be overtaken by the gaze looking back. The shard the first one tried to sneak forth, flickered, like a snake touched on the tip of its tail, then released a segment. An image of Edric, but not the Edric who sat there. This Edric had been planted by whispers from those he once trusted. That image reflected the doubt Edric had projected onto the king, making the king believe it stemmed from him, when in truth it was a deflected strike. Hold, the old priest whispered, and the ring of light hardened, locking the exposed shard in place, while another, shadowy, bearing features of the first one, was drawn to the surface. It could not fully manifest. It writhed like a twitching shell, a dislodged memory still clinging. Then, it spoke, Not with words, but through a vibration along everyone's spines. A resonance deeper than the voice once inside Alaric's head. You think I am the mirror to hold. I am what places you in between. I am the question that makes you reflect me. Edric opened his eyes. Not darkness. Something had touched him and left a layer of signal only he could feel. On his skin, markings emerged, not drawn by spell but etched by reflection itself. A reminder. I have touched you. The extracted fragment of the first one was not fully restrained. It bounced through Edric and latched onto something in the old priest. A sudden tremor made him falter, eyes wide. Someone else, he murmured. It's not just here. Then came the first cost. Edric half collapsed, not from pain but from a tightening in the mind. He looked up at the king, and amid the shattered gazes of reflection, there was a pause, a flick, where the king looked at Edric as if seeing a different tale. Are you all right? The king whispered. Edric replied, voice slightly off. I saw it. It saw me. It asked, who let you take the shard? I didn't permit it, the king answered. I only took enough to see. Not enough, the first one echoed, somewhere between sound and thought. I am what you think is being held. I am what you use to hold. And now I know who's watching. Something shot from Edric, like a sliver of light, streaked across the room and struck a painting on the wall. A portrait of an old ancestor, indirectly tied to the first one's origin. The lines on the painted face came alive. The ancestor's eyes blinked, and below, an old signature, a symbol resembling an inverted mirror, appeared. That can't be, Isolde whispered. Her memory stirred. Traces of someone who once erased Miren's records, who sheltered an exiled priest, who might have passed the gaze of the first one from a hidden corner of history. The twist, Mir himself, the one overseeing the mirror, now curled back, hand trembling, as a shard of the Fomonitomorphont. First one reached into him. A part of the middleman had already been reflected before. While he believed he was aiding, another part had become a secret secondary mirror, housing a sliver of the deeper core. Something had stirred in him, a memory long buried, a morning in his youth at the monastery. A shadow whispered in his ear, record what no one dares see, and hide it beneath the ink of neutrality. Now that whisper blurred, and the reflected bait returned a part of his belief, making him feel both the hunter and the prey. The old priest turned to Alaric, voice hoarse. I think I've been implanted. I'm part of a secondary reflection. If I pull it all out, I may lose myself. If I don't, it'll use me as a new mirror to reach others. How do we know which part is truly yours? Alaric asked. And within that question, the first one responded, not in words. An image flashed in Alaric's mind. An old wooden desk, Isolde's ink pen, a fading record, and in the centre, Mir's handwriting, slightly distorted, as if reflected through murky water. Isolde understood. She stood, voice firm. We cannot kill it, and I won't force you to surrender yourself. I need a new trap. The first one isn't just a reflection. It is the one who grips those holding the mirror. I must make it ask itself, am I the holder or the held? Maera pushed Alvin into the next room. I'll keep the other side. If it tries to touch, reflect it. I'll embed in you a channel to return a sliver of the gaze, something like a sliver of clarity, so it won't consume all. The king stood tall. We're not fully exposed, he said. Part of it has been taken, but the rest is closing. What I do next is pose a question to it. If it thinks it's the prisoner, then who is switching roles? Pull that part out, but don't shatter it. I want to hear it name itself. A scream erupted, not from any mouth, but from the room itself. The deepest reflection's cry, like a stretch of voices entwined and unravelling. In that moment, a face, not clearly defined, emerged amid the white light. A form, like the ancient map of the first one, warping into many eyes, then collapsing into a single point. It was beginning to identify itself. The cliffhanger of this part is not an action, but a binding. The first one, partly extracted, now knows exactly who the holder is among those watching it, and it begins to ask back. It doesn't just want escape, it wants a switch. The old priest, still holding his part, feels the gaze in the reflection turning inward, and a shard of his own memory, once implanted, now raises a question. If I hold the mirror, does the mirror hold me? Edric, bearing the mark of the touch, hears a voice not of the first one anymore, but of a deeper entity. The first one is being watched. Who is watching back? They stood at the edge of the decision, not merely to hold or to release, but to switch roles. The first one was no longer a hunted shadow. It had become an inverted gaze, a reflection capable of questioning itself. When the whisper merge entered Alaric's mind, something inside him trembled. Not temptation, but a silent pact. The power to see clearly, in exchange for a part that would not fully dissolve. One could use a fragment of it as a safety door, but that door carried a reverse key, allowing it to stare back at its holder. Edric, still bearing part of the first one under the circle of white light, was the first to respond. He asked for nothing more. He bowed and slowly produced a small wooden box from his chest and opened it. Inside lay a jagged fragment of mirror, marked by countless touches of reflection. "I will let it lodge in me," he said, voice tinged with vengeance under calm resolve. "The first one will think it occupies me, but I will force it to look at itself. I will place part of me as an external mirror for the part it tries to latch onto. If it wants to self-recognize, it must do so through me." Isolde hurriedly grabbed her pen and ink, each line anchoring the narrative. Edric is imprisoned by the gaze. That gaze not only looks, but is also looked back, with a name, a root, a condition. It is contained within its own trust. She handed the note to the old priest, who whispered a binding incantation over Edric. Not to fully trap him, but to mark the contact. A small frame where any attempt by the first one to turn would instantly be recorded. The old priest did not withdraw entirely. He used the layer of gaze the first one had woven onto him, before as a hook, then placed a counter-reflection over Alaric. "I will keep the other part as the frame," he whispered to Myra. "If it tries to turn toward me, I will use him," he pointed to Alaric, "as a mirror to push it back." Myra, holding the inscribed glass in her palm, approached Edric. She placed a small black shard onto the reflection attached to him and dropped another drop of the king's blood onto its edge to seal the truth binding. "Hold this," she said to Edric, "but don't let it see me through you. I'll wrap another layer outside of you, something it never senses as reflection. If it tries to bind both, it will discover the window itself." Alaric stepped forward without words. He touched the lingering rays of light around Edric's circle, then let a sliver of his own reflected intent merge into its edge. The whisper in his mind shifted tone. Not a cold invitation to merge, but a warning. "I can show you. I can also make you bear the mark. Choose who first, me or it." They began the pull, not a rushing rupture, but layer after layer, each gentle incision. Edric closed his eyes, not resisting. The first one slithered through him like a serpent, pressing onto flesh, probing, trying to find a stable centre to cling to. And it saw not a frail Edric, but a Edric wrapped in another layer. The counter-reflection column, woven by the old priest, bound by Isolde's inscriptions, and beyond that a thin window from Alaric. When it tried to drive inward, it was pushed back. Something recoiled. "I am both the one who holds and the one held," its voice echoed, taut as a string. "You believed you gave me a shard. I did more than take. I reflect back what you used to hold me." Edric let out a small groan, not in pain but from internal tremor, and opened his eyes. On the back of his neck, runic markings spread in striped veins. Not a spell script, but a reflection engraving itself. I touched. I understood. The old priest blinked, realizing the secondary reflection he tried to maintain was wavering. An old memory in him surfaced, not summoned, but embedded by the first one, that ancient morning at the monastery. And the darker voice from below echoed, "Do not trust what you hold. I can turn you into a mirror." He hesitated, while Alaric, feeling the tremor from him, nodded slightly, answering, "I hold part of you. I do not allow it to consume all." The pull was successful. A deeper core burst forth, not a solid form but an echoing structure, something between doubt and consciousness, sounding like many voices joined. The shape, a non-fixed keeper, appearing as a clustering light reflected in countless small eyes, expanded, then contracted, and then fractured. It was beginning to recognize itself. "You think you named me?" Its voice resonated, deeper than before, not just in Edric's heart, but across the room. "I am what grips those who grip. I am the question that causes the gaze to question itself. If you bind me, I will bind back. If you hold me, I will turn you into your own mirror." The king's gaze never left Edric. "Keep holding." "But expose what?" he asked. Not to interrogate, but as a condition. "I need the root. Speak its name. Who placed you into me? Who allowed you to touch other holders?" The first one responded indirectly. A flash of light turned, sliding across the ancestor portrait on the wall, through Edric, and onto Isolde's scroll, where her freshly written text morphed into another sentence. "You hold me, but you let me look at whom?" Isolde folded the note quickly, eyes wide. "It doesn't just reflect, it's rewriting my narrative. It wants me to chronicle myself as a tool." Behind them, Alaric felt something was wrong. Whatever rose from the drawn-out portion of the first one was not simply recognition, but a phantom arm stretched to latch onto another holder, the old priest. He turned and saw the priest's expression shift, and in his mind's ear, a whisper echoed, "Who is the mirror? Who is being mirrored?" The sudden twist, the old priest, who initially intended not to let the entire shard fuse into Edric, was now blurred by his own prior reflection. A fragment of ancient memory, his monastery morning, surfaced as evidence, and a darker voice from below proclaimed, "Don't trust what you hold. You'll become the mirror bearer." Maera pressed close and placed a thin, reinforcing frame of inscribed glass over him for protection. "Hold the narrative," she whispered. "Don't let it overwrite your signature." Then, as a triggered response, something sprang, not from Edric, but from the old middleman in the palace. The false Edric, who was performing to bait the gaze, sensed a tremor emerging from deep under. Twist. The first one, believing it had been identified, had planted a reflection bait back into its own false network, causing Edric's double to have unsettling behavioural gaps. The king observed and saw a momentary distortion, and seriously questioned, "Is that Edric?" A scream rang out, not from someone in the room, but from a reflection outside, a child in the outskirts, once Tavin's secret messenger, who noticed his own small mirror shifting. She sent a flash alert through the old network. It is not only held, it is demanding exchange. Those who hold the mirror are held in return. The air in the room was no longer merely silent. It had a shape, a kind of stillness, as if every sound was suspended in glass, hanging between space and decision. Edric sat motionless, eyes wide open, still holding the shard of mirror he had once willingly allowed the first one to pour into. But now no one was sure what remained in Edric, and what was reflecting back through him. Maera stepped forward first, but not too close. "Alaric," she said softly, "can you still see his eyes?" "Not clearly," Alaric replied, his voice hoarse. "It's like looking into a lake. ripples on the surface, but you can't tell if it's the wind or something beneath the water. The old priest, his hands still trembling, pulled out a chain from around his neck on which hung a dim, tarnished mirror that had been with him since youth. "I used to think this mirror was only for self-reflection," he murmured. "But now, it may be the only thing that can see the reflection the first one left behind." He held the mirror toward Edric. At first, nothing changed, but then a dark circle appeared on Edric's forehead, like a drop of ink falling into clear water. And from that, a glimmering thread of light slowly curved out from his forehead, floating like a glowing filament. The group held their breath. That thread wasn't exactly light. It was like an idea woven into shape, and it was drifting straight toward the king. He didn't move. The eyes of the medieval king, who had witnessed schemes, betrayals, and treachery, now faced something his court had never dared name aloud. "You've chosen," Edric whispered. It was no longer his voice. "You chose the mirror," the voice continued. "But the mirror does not only reflect, it holds form, and that form requires an ego. I am no illusion. I am the structure of the very faith you once betrayed." The king closed his eyes. "And if I shatter you," the first one inside Edric said, "who will hold the shards of the mirror?" Isolde grabbed her notebook, flipped to a blank page, and placed it on the table. As she did, symbols began appearing on it automatically, as if an invisible hand were writing. They were broken lines of text. When the reflected gazes into the mirror for too long, the mirror begins to shift shape, not to reflect, but to force the gazer's shape into its structure. The mirror doesn't break, the person does. Maera pulled Alaric back. "This isn't right," she whispered. "If Edric is being held by the first one, then he's no longer the anchor. The mirror is reversing, holder becoming held, and vice versa." Alaric didn't respond immediately. In his mind, the whisper grew clearer. "Do you know who you are if I stare at you long enough? I will carve the answer into the bottom of your eyes." Suddenly Edric stood up. The symbols on his forehead spread across his temples like smouldering tree roots. "Do you know who I am?" he asked the king directly. "I am the unspoken question, the choice you ignored to avoid facing yourself." The king didn't retreat. He reached back to where the royal sword had been placed at the start of the council and drew it from its sheath. "Your name is not a question," the king said. "Your name is consequence." And they lunged at each other. The clash was not merely of metal and flesh, it was of memory and reflection. The mirror did not shatter, but fragments of memory from both began to glow around the room like puzzle pieces of a painting no one had ever seen. The king saw himself at age 12, learning to tie the ceremonial knot on a flag, his hands trembling in the cold. Edric saw the moment he betrayed his father's oath and stepped into the secret society, vowing to become the middleman for something greater than himself. They both saw a shared image. A faceless child gazing into a mirror, not knowing what was real. The sword slashed across Edric's shoulder, blood splattering. But it wasn't red. The blood shimmered silver, like mercury. Maera screamed. "No! If his blood has fused with the first one's core, then every wound is a part of the reflection." Isolde grabbed the half-written page and tore it in two. One half she placed beneath the king's feet, the other beneath Edric's. She whispered, "If the mirror holds, divide it so it doesn't know whom to choose." The truth was, the first one wasn't omnipotent. It couldn't exist in two bodies at once if its reflection was split. And Isolde's act of tearing the page divided its anchor. Edric staggered back, hand trembling, silver blood seeping from the wound. But his eyes slowly began to return to himself. "I am still here," he whispered. "But it is still watching." The king lowered his sword. I see you now. Both of you. And then something strange happened. A sliver of light on Edric's forehead detached like a feather and floated toward Alaric, silently merging with him. No one had time to react. In that moment, Alaric stood still, and the first one, or at least a fragment of it, whispered in his mind, "You are now the final mirror bearer. I will no longer speak, I will watch and wait." The room after the battle became strangely empty, not because it lacked people, but because those who remained were all becoming scattered fragments, separated by something they couldn't name. The invisible presence of a thing now lying inside Alaric. He sat beside the oil lamp that had just been relit. The flickering light on his face seemed uncertain, as if it too were wondering. Whom to illuminate? What? Inside him, the voice of the first one no longer echoed as before. No urging, no threats. Only waiting. A terrible silence, as if it was waiting to see whether Alaric would step into the mirror himself. "Are you all right?" Maera sat across from him, holding his hand. Her hand was cold and trembling. Alaric nodded, but then, after a deep breath, he spoke softly, like a confession. "It didn't possess me. I let it in." Everyone was stunned. Isolde set down her pen. "Why?" Alaric turned to Edric, still seated beside the pool of silver blood. His face pale, but his eyes once again his own. "Because I understand. We can't kill it like an animal. We can't seal it like an evil spirit. It is reflection, and it grows stronger every time we turn away from ourselves." The old priest sighed, closed his eyes and muttered an ancient prayer. Then he said, "You intend to keep it forever?" "No," Alaric replied. "I will carry it to the one place where light cannot reflect." The king rose, weary but still regal. He walked slowly toward Alaric and handed him the royal sword, a blade never given to anyone else. "If you carry it away, carry with it the burden of all of us. Don't let anyone else ever look into that mirror again." Alaric took it. He didn't bow. He just looked straight ahead. "And if someone tries to find it, then we will forget," the king replied. "We will bury its name. We will rewrite history as if it never existed." Mirren had been consumed. The engraved glass was placed back into its wooden box sealed with blood, not to be broken, but to be hidden. Edric was returned to a sealed chamber, not as a criminal, but as a memory that needed guarding. Isolde burned her old notebook, then began writing a new story, this time without the name of the first one. Only a darkness everyone has faced, but no one dares to name. Alaric left at dawn the next morning. No one saw him off. Only Maera left him with one final sentence. "Don't let it make you think that silence means agreement. As long as you're still you, it has never won." He walked into the forest toward the grey mountains where sunlight never reached. He didn't look back, and far away, deep in the memory of mankind, a mirror remains, untouched, unremembered, unsaid. But sometimes when someone stares too long into their own eyes in the mirror, they see a glimmer of silver light, a whisper. "I am still here." This is the end of the story. I hope you have a good night's sleep. If any part of it stood out to you or left an impression, wake up tomorrow and leave a comment below. Thank you all for watching.